Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who is joining us online. I'm delighted to be welcoming you to this conversational debate on behalf of the South African Debate Initiative. My name is Dave Gilchrist, based out of Sydney, Australia, and I will be moderating today's debate. Just a reminder of the title of the debate. The debate title is Did the Gospel Evolve? Markan Priority and its Implications. So before we go ahead, I'd love to welcome all of our speakers today. So let me begin by welcoming our speakers on the Muslim side. I'd like to welcome Yusuf Ismail, based in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. Good morning, Yusuf. It's great to see you again.
Good morning, Dave. Good morning to all the rest of you.
And then I'd like to welcome Dr. Shabir Ali, based out of Toronto, Canada. Good evening, Shabir. Great to see you again.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be on. I'm so glad I'm here, and thank you all for giving me this opportunity to chat with you.
Excellent. And moving on to the Christian side. So let me start by introducing Reverend Samuel Green, based in Australia. Good morning, Samuel. Good to see you again.
Hello, Dave, and everyone else. It's great to be with you again.
And then I'd like to welcome Rudolf Boshoff, also based out of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. Good morning, Rudolf. Great to see you.
Hey, Dave. Good to be back with you guys.
Excellent. Before we get started, just a quick reminder of the structure of today's debate. So we will begin with opening statements from each of our speakers for 15 minutes each. It will be Yusuf, and then Reverend Samuel Green, then Dr. Shabir, and then Rudolf. We'll then go into rebuttals of 8 minutes each, following that same sequence. We'll then have a time of cross-examination, where the Muslim side asks the Christian side questions for 15 minutes, followed by a further cross-examination where the Christian side asks the Muslim side, also for 15 minutes. And then we will have our closing arguments after that of 4 minutes each. So Rudolf will go first there, followed by Yusuf, then Samuel, and then Shabir. So that's our structure for today. So what I'd like to do is begin by inviting Yusuf to be presenting the first opening statement. So Yusuf, over to you. I'll be timing us, and my understanding is you don't have any PowerPoints, so we'll be happy to go ahead with you speaking from there.
Thank you. I begin in the name of God, most gracious, most merciful. Once again, it's great to see all of you. Some of my favorite apologists out here, both Muslim and Christian. I really enjoy discussing these subjects with all of you. I think let's just start off with this point that most biblical and New Testament scholars today, in fact, agree that Mark is the earliest of the three synoptic gospels to have been written. And there are several compelling reasons why this particular view is accepted. Now, although these arguments do not present irrefutable proof of what is described as Markan priority, the effect is persuasive to most people. The first reason to accept Markan priority is what we call the order of the pericopes. A pericope is essentially a section within the text that contains a thematic outline about a miracle, an idea, saying like, for example, Jesus walking on water and so on. And Mark's ordering of the pericopes appear to explain the agreements in order amongst the three synoptics. Synoptics meaning Mark, Matthew, and Luke. The best explanation for this ordering, most scholars maintain, is that Matthew and Luke follow what's called the Markan order. And I see Samuel's got a nice slide which may be going into explaining that. And further, Matthew and Luke, although they do depart from Mark's order, never do they together agree against his order. And that essentially suggests that Mark is a backbone of the synoptic gospels. The second reason is that despite Mark's gospel being the shortest of the synoptics, his pericopes are generally the wordiest. It's got a lot of description. Mark, often the author of Mark rather, includes details that you find lacking in Matthew and Luke, whereas Matthew and Luke tend to leave out the unnecessary word and details. And there are many reasons for believing that Matthew and Luke use Mark. One reason is that compared with Mark, Matthew and Luke show many improvements. And what's one of our discussions this evening? Such improvements include, kind of accurate citation of historical facts, and from a Christian point of view, a kind of a more accurate theology. So here's the issue. If Mark was the first gospel that was written, how do you explain that there are many places where Matthew and Luke also agree with each other, but not with Mark? And if they didn't get these passages from each other, but they agree word from word where they in fact agree in the pericopes or in their descriptions of Jesus, where are they actually copying from? And that's where we come to this idea of something called Q. Q is a hypothetical source. It's something that scholars believe was used by Matthew and Luke to supplement the materials they got from Mark. Hypothetical, obviously, because it no longer survives. And the Q hypothesis was developed in the 19th century, and that's been the dominant view of scholarship from the past century. One of the books which discusses this is a New Testament historical introduction to early Christian writings. I think I left it in my library. It's by Bart Ehrman. It has a good background of Q, gives you a good kind of overall view. Now we go to the main issue, and that is looking at this order of Mark, then Matthew and Luke, and then, of course, last John. You have something called the evolving of Christology, or the idea of evolving Christology, the belief that the understanding of Jesus' work in person and status developed over time within the Gospels. That idea was primarily developed by proponents of what is described in German as the Religionsgeschichtliche school, the history of religion schools, the Tübingen school in the 19th and the 20th centuries. Some of the key proponents of this are people like William Bousset, who died in 1920. His work, Kyrios Christos, in 1913 is regarded as foundational. Bousset argued that the early Christianity moved from a low Christology to a higher Christology, worshipping Jesus as divine under the influence of Hellenistic Gentile communities. Adolf von Harnack, who died in 1931, he argued that early Christianity was Hellenized, and there was change from a simple essence of Christianity to complex metaphysical dogmas that you can later find in John's Gospel, which you find in Gnosticism and so on, the influence of that. And then more recently, James D.G. Dunn, who died, in fact, I think in 2020, recently, he argued, for example, in books like Unity and Diversity in the New Testament, that Christology developed from an initial focus on the earthly Jesus, evolving over the first century into a belief in his pre-existence, and that could be found in many of the gospel writings. In other words, Mark, we argue, presents a low Christology of Jesus, Matthew slightly developing, and Luke, and then John, you have the most pronounced idea of Jesus. Now, what do conservative scholars say about this? You look at N.T. Wright, Tom Wright, widely respected conservative British New Testament scholar. In his work called Jesus and the Victory of God, he argues that Jesus, a first century Jew, had to operate within a specific historical context. And his suggestion is that, yes, this development can be seen, but this basically is that this is effectively a case of Jesus revealing his identity or developing or maturing towards the latter stages. Now, whilst he holds to the divinity of Christ, right, he actually argues against a static portrayal of Jesus, in the sense that Jesus doesn't explicitly announce his divinity in the early Gospels. He says, so many of the conservatives basically make this point that, yes, this development of this very humanly portrayal of Jesus as the suffering servant, which is found in Mark, and this evolution is not basically the author changing it, but it's something like a progressive revelation, a progressive understanding, rather than an evolution of his essential nature. And so Wright argues that Jesus understood himself in Mark's gospel as a first century prophet whose mission was to embody the return of Yahweh to Zion. And then there was a kind of a developed awareness, gradually embracing the belief that he was to do and be what only God could do and be. And that's why you find it in John. So the development from the lower to a higher Christology across the Gospels, that's a central topic of biblical studies. There is a consensus, but those conservative scholars who hold on to this principle hold on the basis that it is a form of progressive revelation. So here are the examples of the progression. For example, a low Christology where there's a focus on the humanity and mission of Christ. Mark 13:32, Jesus says, of that day and that hour no one knows, not the angels in heaven, not the Son, only the Father. The emphasis again is on the human limitation and submission to the Father. In Mark 6:5, he could do no miracles except lay his hands on a few sick people. In Matthew and Luke, there's an adoptionist position where adoptionist position in the sense that Jesus is identified as the Son of God, but only at his baptism, often interpreted in a low context as a moment his divine vocation is empowered or inaugurated, then of course develops. Now you find the emerging high Christology or the developing Christology starting from Matthew, where in Matthew 1 you have the emphasis on Jesus as the Emmanuel, a kind of a higher assertion of divinity than Mark's focus on Jesus as a prophet or a servant. You have the emphasis on worship in Matthew, where the disciples worship Jesus and they say, truly you are the Son of God. You have the discussion of the virgin birth in Matthew and Luke, nowhere to be found in Mark. Why not? So in terms of the summary of progression then, you have a point where you can clearly see in the Gospels, in which the conservative scholars all agree, at least those who subscribe to this position, that Mark focuses on Jesus as the suffering servant, the prophet with the divinity that's veiled until the end. Matthew and Luke introduce the birth narratives, the virgin birth, to emphasize the divine origin whilst maintaining his human ministry. And then John, of course, presents the idea of the word becoming flesh, focusing on the descending divine Son who reveals the Father. And then, of course, scholars point to the editorial changes where Matthew and Luke took Mark's earlier low accounts and adjusted them to reflect a kind of a higher authority or perfection. And that's what's described as progressive embellishment in the actual Gospels. So, for example, and we've discussed some of this on the last occasion, could Jesus do something or did he not do something? The removing the human limitations. In Mark 6:5, Mark says Jesus could not do any miracles because of the people's lack of faith. But in Matthew 13, verse 58, Matthew changes it to Jesus did not do many miracles, suggesting that Jesus' power, removing the suggestion rather that Jesus' power was limited by human belief. So can you see, could not to did not? There's a choice. Healing with spit. Mark includes two stories where Jesus uses physical means like spit to heal in Mark 7 and Mark 8. But Matthew and Luke omit these details, likely, trying to move away these magical physical techniques towards a higher view of Jesus just by him healing through his words. The unknown him in Mark 5:30, Jesus asks, I think when the woman touches him and he feels something pulls away from him, he says, who touches his clothes or who touches his garments? Because he felt power go away from him. But in Matthew 9:22, the same recollection that ignorance is removed and Jesus identifies the woman. So why does Matthew make Jesus identify the woman, but Mark makes him ignorant? The divine status and title of Jesus in Mark 10:18, he asks the rich ruler, why do you call me good? No one is good except God. Matthew edits it to why do you ask about what is good, to avoid implications that Jesus is, of course, distinguishing himself from God's goodness. And of course, the story of the walking on the water, that in Mark, the disciples are amazed, they are hard-hearted, they are sarcastic. In Matthew, they respond with a high confession, worshiping him, truly that he is the Son of God. Then you look at the I am statements, where he says there's a kind of an echoing, the echo I me, the echoing of the divine name of God from Exodus. You find this in John 8:58, before Abraham I am. That's a claim to divine pre-existence. John uses several metaphors to divine this specific function. He's a light of the world, he's a bread of the life. None of this is found in Matthew, Luke, or even Mark. Why is it only in John? What's the emphasis there? What about the transfiguration comparison? In Mark chapter 9, verse 3, you find that Jesus' clothes become dazzling white, whiter than anything. In Matthew, his face shone like white, making him more like a kind of a radiant figure or a divine being. In Luke, he adds that Moses and Elijah were speaking of his departure in Exodus, framing the event in a kind of a cosmic or salvific context. So you can clearly see that Matthew and Luke and Mark Matthew and Luke edited Mark to improve the literary style, correct embarrassing details, and enhance the disciples' images and of course, deepen theological points. It's clearly there. Matthew condenses narratives to focus on teachings, like he adds a Sermon on the Mount, whereas Luke, with a polished Greek, there's emphasis on universalism. It's a more orderly account. He's a physician. He highlights Jesus' compassion, which is not found earlier. So, the improving of the disciples' images, removing the embarrassing details, could not do miracles to did not do miracles, adding theological significance. For example, where Peter tells him in Mark, you are the Messiah, and in Matthew, he adds, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Clearly, those are two different statements, and clearly there's a more pronounced emphasis reflecting a higher Christology in Matthew's gospel. And of course, there's editorial fatigue, where in Mark's gospel, there's a talk about feeding of 5,000 in deserted places, but in Luke, you find kind of a slight consistency located at Bethsaida. If you look at the miracle stories, for example, Mark's original version, I gave you the story about the spit. Jesus uses spit and physical touch. Matthew, he edits it. He removes the spit in Matthew 8. Luke omits the spit miracles to maintain a kind of a dignified image of Jesus. The crowd interaction, I gave you the point of who touched my clothes. The ignorance is removed from Matthew. And in Luke, which is later, even further, there's an astonishment of the crowd showing theological response. The disciples in Mark's version, in many of the stories, like the story of the storm at sea and so on, there's a terrified portrayal, a lack of understanding. And in Matthew's edit, there's a change of no faith. They have no faith in Mark to having little faith, but still making them flawed but faithful. And in Luke's edit of Matthew, there's a testing of the disciples' faith in difficult moments. You look at the story of the fig tree. It's difficult to see why Mark would take Matthew's account and, to change it as if to make it appear that Jesus made such a mistake, which he made in Mark, but that mistake is removed, and then curse the fig tree according to his own frustration. In Mark's account, the tree discovered withered. The tree discovered withered as the disciples passed it. But Matthew specifically says that the tree withered to its roots as soon as he cursed it. So again, it's clear to see that Matthew has magnified the power of Jesus, and there's no reason for thinking that Mark would want to minimize. So that there's no reason to think that Mark would want to minimize Jesus' power. So based on this, folks, it's quite clear that when you look at the stories and the narratives, is that they're not just given, that we're not just told the stories, but it's quite clear that the writers of these gospels were presenting these narratives about Jesus in order to basically present certain theological motifs. And so the argument and the thrust and thesis in today's discussion is that the earliest gospel, Mark, based on Markan priority, if you have to accept Markan priority, you have to also accept the principle that there's a clear evolution in the way Jesus is pronounced from Mark to Matthew to Luke, and of course, eventually to John, where he's this kind of divine cosmic figure that's pronounced. And that seems to be the scholarly consensus in the world today. And I think I leave it at that. I've finished my 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Yusuf. We're going to move into Reverend Samuel's opening statement. So let me just bring up your slides, Samuel. Great.
Okay.
So we'll hand over to you.
Now I should be on. Thank you very much for that, Yusuf. That was a helpful introduction. And I want to go again with explaining the synoptic source theory here. And I want to agree with what Yusuf has just said, that because we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we can look at them and study how they have how they've been constructed. One of the worst things the early Christians could have done would have been to have destroyed Mark, Luke, and John and just kept Matthew. If we'd just done that, we wouldn't be able to do this work. But because we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we can actually compare them and take a step back to look at the sources that have come in. So this is actually an excellent thing that Christians can do. It's not a weakness. The worst thing would have been to destroy 3 of them and just keep one. Then we wouldn't be able to take this step back. So it's actually a very positive thing that we're able to do here. And I want to agree that from the evidence that I've looked at, that Mark is the first one. It's before Mark and Luke. We see that all of these people are working around the same time and in a group. And so it's not that these are separated by long distances of time or anything, but it's a common group with common material, and the synoptic observations that we can make just sort of point out how there's this common material and this sharing of this common material among them. Now, what I want to do is to look at this development idea, and I'm going to get straight into what Yusuf was saying there. So here's an example of the type of thing that Yusuf was saying, which I will, which I'll give some examples. So, and a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But when he was in the stern, asleep on a cushion, and they woke him and said, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was great calm. Now you'll see there that in Mark, Jesus is called the teacher. Okay, the teacher. Now, when Matthew retells that, it's the same storm, and Jesus rebukes it and calms it with a word, but he's called Lord. And it's this type of thing where people will say, see how Matthew has developed the story. Jesus has gone from being a teacher to now being the Lord. Now, I just want to bring up a couple of points here. The first is that if we actually read the whole New Testament, this is what Jesus says. He says, "You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for I do so." And so just because Matthew says Lord, that doesn't necessarily mean a development, because Jesus was called teacher and Lord by his disciples. And so that's not really a point. That could just be, as we would think it is, just a matter of the eyewitness testimonies, and how the same story being told by a different witness might have a few different words here or there as they retell the same story. Secondly, though, in both accounts, Jesus calms the storm like God with a word. If in Mark, Jesus prayed to God for the storm to be stilled, so Jesus is praying to God for the storm to be stilled, but in Matthew, he spoke as God, then you could conclude that there's some development. But this is not what happens. In both accounts, Jesus speaks with the authority of God, and so there's no development. Now, the next point I want to say is this, that the problem with this methodology is that the development sometimes goes the other way. It sometimes goes the other way. So this is in Mark. This is Jesus healing the paralytic man who's let down through the roof. And we read, now some of the teachers of the law were sitting there thinking to themselves, "Why does this fellow talk like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" So a very strong statement that he's blaspheming, and then saying, this is what only God can do. Okay. Now look at how Matthew retells it. Some men brought him a paralytic lying on a mat. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Take heart, son, your sins are forgiven." At this, some of the teachers of the law said to themselves, "This fellow is blaspheming." And so the phrase, "who can forgive sins but God alone," is not there. Now, according to that development theology, so that development methodology, these stories should have been the other way around. You should have had the stronger statement about what Jesus is doing is what only God can do. That should have been in Matthew, but it's actually in Mark. And so this is one of my critiques for this development, that yes, you can find examples to prove your case, but there's also examples that go the other direction. And so I want to just say that I don't think that this methodology actually holds water if it can go both ways. What I want to do now is I want to show that the comparing of words and parallel events can be misleading if only a few examples are given. Instead, you need to compare the Gospels as a whole And if we do, I think we get a very different picture. And that's what I want to do now. I want to take us through the titles of Jesus. So this is going to be a big sweep of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So let's see how we go. So Jesus is called teacher, and I've given you the references here. In Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, in all of the Gospels, he's called teacher, often. It's not just that he's not called it. No. Throughout all the Gospels, he's called teacher. He's called rabbi. You can see he's called rabbi a few times, less, but he's called rabbi in Matthew, Mark. Surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, in Luke, as it's a term applied to Jesus less, but also in John quite a lot. Rabbi, son of David. Again, I'm just showing you the references here where Jesus is called the son of David. There may be a reference in John 7:42. It's where other people are calling him that, or talking about that. So it may not be in John, and so that there might be a difference there, that John doesn't use the son of David. Now, when Jesus is called Lord, well, he's called Lord often in Matthew. He's called Lord, several, what was it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times in Mark. He's called Lord often in Luke. Remember that Luke and Matthew are longer Gospels. And he's called Lord often in John. He's called the Messiah or the Christ regularly in all of these Gospels. And he's called the Son of God, either by others, or either by the voice from heaven, from God, from demons who are scared of him, or from others, or from himself. So that the phrase Son of God is throughout all the Gospels. He's called Son of Man. That's all the way through them as well. And God is Father, spoken of as Father in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So I just wanted to show that the standard titles, in fact, all of the titles we have of Jesus, maybe except for Emmanuel, so I didn't put that one in there, but we'll come back to that later on. But all of the major titles that we have of Jesus are just used consistently by all the Gospels in a plentiful way. And so from that, you couldn't really say that there's a development in the names of Jesus, because it's evenly spread across all of them. Now, what about with his Christology? Well, the first thing I would point out is that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all begin by quoting Isaiah 40, and at some other point, Malachi 3:1, although John doesn't have Malachi, but they all have Isaiah 40. And that's interesting because Isaiah 40 is all about God coming. And so this is how they all begin. They all begin by saying Jesus is God coming to us, and John the Baptist is the messenger who's preparing the way for God to come. And that's just what Isaiah 40 and Malachi 3 are about. They're about God coming to his people. And John is identified as the John the Baptist figure of Malachi, and Jesus is God coming. But Mark has that in the same way that John does. So yes, they might have differences in that John might have the word, his Logos theology, but he's still using Isaiah 40. They all do. Jesus is spoken of as the heavenly Son. This is when Jesus has been talking about the greatest command in Israel, to love the Lord your God. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. But then Jesus proceeds to go to Psalm 110 and talk about the heavenly Son, and says that the Messiah is not simply the Son of David, he's the heavenly Son. And we get this in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that Jesus is the heavenly Son. In fact, the contrast between the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and Psalm 110, the heavenly Son, is strongest in Mark. The strongest emphasis of the heavenly Son is in Mark there. Jesus' pre-existence. Now, I might be pushing it here, but the way I see Jesus' pre-existence is basically the way John the Baptist talks about him, where John says, he is before me and I am not worthy to touch his feet. And that's and he's going to be giving the Holy Spirit. Now, that's the way God's spoken about in the Old Testament, that he is not worthy for you to come before and to touch him. And from in Joel, it's God who's going to give the Holy Spirit. And so this is how John introduces Jesus, with Isaiah 40, he's the one giving the Spirit. He's the one I'm not worthy to touch. And so it seems to be attributing divinity to Jesus, and certainly John does. We've got the fact that Jesus does not know the hour or that he learned. Now, Mark says this, but so does Matthew and Luke, and John to some degree as well, where he says he only knows from the Father. So they all have that Jesus did not know the hour, and Luke in particular has the idea that Jesus learned and grew in wisdom. Now, Christians have got to work that out, but they all have that. That hasn't been taken away. And then just briefly looking at the events in Jesus' life, we have the virgin birth, and you can certainly see some differences here where Matthew and Luke have the virgin birth, but Mark and John don't. And so, yeah, we can talk about why that's the case, and that's worthwhile having that discussion. I assume, though, for Muslims that shouldn't be a problem, as you accept that story, that particular source has made its way into the Quran as well. So that shouldn't be a problem for you for Matthew and Luke to have it. They all have Jesus doing signs and miracles to show who he is. They all have him being crucified, died, and rising. Mark doesn't have that ending. We may have lost the ending to Mark there, but throughout the gospel, Jesus is talking about, I'm going to die, I'm going to rise on the third day. And so, the gospel does finish with it being announced that he has been raised. So he's crucified, died, and has been raised. That's all the way through. And the idea that he's a sacrifice for sin is spoken about in the Last Supper, where he talks about himself and his blood is a new covenant. And so that's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They all have that new covenant in my blood, that sacrifice for sin. And then they'll have other statements that the Son of Man came not to serve, but to be served and to give his life as a ransom for many. John doesn't have that because he seems to be complementing the other Gospels, and that's another discussion. But he talks about Jesus as the sacrificial lamb in a couple of places. And so I just wanted to show people the overwhelming unity that we have between Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, I'm not saying that Matthew and Luke haven't used Mark, and as apostles and part of the apostolic team, taught those sources in a different, with their own emphases. But I'm saying that when we actually do that comprehensive overview, they are teaching the same thing. So, yes, there are different emphases between the Gospels, but I think that when we look at this, we see a faithful transmission of what Mark had in Matthew and Luke. We see Mark being faithfully transmitted, and his message not being rewritten and altered, but an emphasis being given for the new gospel that's been written. So I'll finish up there. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Samuel. Let me remove your slides. So we're going to move on to Dr. Shabir's opening statement of 15 minutes. So I'm going to hand over to you, Dr. Shabir.
Sure. Just a minute. And, all right. Let me just get my timer set up as well. Where's my timer? Here. All right. Gentlemen, I'm so glad that you have welcomed me into this platform. I begin by praising our creator and fashioner, the creator of the heavens and the earth. I ask God to bless our meeting here tonight, to make it fruitful and enlightening for us and for our audience. And I pray that God will bless all of the righteous people of all time, all of his prophets, his messengers, and God will bless us and all of our loved ones. May God bless the entire world and bring about peace and security and safety for everyone in the world. Men and women of understanding, I feel that our dialogue is very important. It is a part of the wider scope of world peace, and the more we talk to each other, the more we understand, and it is important that we understand not only our differences, but how much we have in common. Reverend Samuel spoke about the fact that Muslims and Christians do have some common beliefs, especially with regards to Jesus. Muslims believe that Jesus was God's Messiah, who was born of the Virgin Mary, that he performed many miraculous deeds by the permission of God, and that he was raised to heaven. However, I've been asked many times by evangelical Christians, do you accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior? My answer is that Jesus himself did not make such claims. Rather, the story about him in the Bible evolved in that direction. Let's turn to the topic at hand. Does Markan priority imply that the message of Jesus in the four Gospels evolved? In other words, did the Gospels evolve? Markan priority and its implications. Yusuf has done an excellent job of showing such evolution with regards to the claim that Jesus is Lord. Reverend Samuel offered a counter to that, and I will have something to say in reply to Samuel later. Presently, I will show that a similar evolution occurred with regards to the story about Jesus' death and resurrection. First, a reminder about the literary relationship among the Gospels in the Bible. Most scholars consider Mark as the first and John last. Most scholars believe that Matthew and Luke use Mark as their primary source for the events that they narrate. Some scholars think that Luke used both Mark and Matthew. When we look at the way in which Jesus' story is told in these four Gospels, it is obvious that the later the Gospel, the more Christian the story becomes. Let's see an example of how Matthew rewrites an episode that he gleaned from Mark. Looking at Jesus' death, as described in Mark, we see in Mark chapter 15, verse 37, but Jesus cried out with a loud voice and breathed his last, and the temple curtain was torn in two from top to bottom. Mark chapter 15, verse 37 and 38. By comparison, Matthew expands this to read, then Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and gave up his spirit. Just then, the temple curtain was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook and the rocks were split apart and tombs were opened and the bodies of many saints who had died were raised. They came out of their tombs. They came out of the tombs after his resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. Matthew 27 verses 50 to 53. As is obvious, Matthew expanded the narrative to show that the death of Jesus caused the resurrection of the saints. Here's another example of how Matthew expands upon Mark. In Mark's gospel, Jesus was placed in a tomb on the Friday evening, and the stone was rolled against the opening, and everyone left the scene. When the women arrived on Sunday morning, the rock was already rolled away, and the body was no longer there. That's Mark chapter 16, verses 4 to 6. This makes readers wonder what happened when the tomb wasn't guarded. Matthew, however, assures his readers that from Saturday onwards, the tomb was guarded. Matthew 27, verse 66. Recall that, according to Mark, when the women arrived on Sunday morning, the rock had already been rolled back. Mark's readers are left with the uneasy feeling that no one could testify to what happened from the Friday night to the Sunday morning. However, Matthew rewrites the story as follows. Now, after the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. Suddenly, there was a severe earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven, came and rolled away the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were shaken and became like dead men because they were so afraid of him. Matthew 28, verses 1 to 4. Thus, Matthew makes the guards the sole witnesses to the resurrection, but they are hostiles. So they spread the news that while they were asleep, the disciples came and stole the body. Matthew 27:13. It is clear that Matthew has improved the story over that of Mark. Not all Gospels improve the story in every instance or in the same way. For example, Matthew alone among the 4 Gospels mentions guards at the tomb. However, when we continue comparing the Gospels, we see that the general trend is that the later Gospels improve the story, making it more and more Christian. Let's look at John as the 4th synoptic Gospels, the 4th synoptic Gospel. In what follows, I will contrast Mark, the first Gospel, with John, which is widely regarded as the last of the 4 to be written. Some scholars think that John used Matthew, Mark, and Luke. This is why Mark Goodacre coined the term the 4th synoptic Gospel as a reference to John. Regardless of whether or not John used the previous Gospels, we need only to keep in mind that Mark was first and John came last. Henceforth, I will show how the story of Jesus in John is more Christian than it is in Mark. This means that during the decades from when Mark was written to the time John is written, the story of Jesus evolved. Let's see some examples. How willing was Jesus to die? In the 4th Gospel, Jesus declares that no one takes his life from him. Rather, he lays it down himself and takes it up again. John chapter 10, verse 18. In the first 3 Gospels, by contrast, Jesus prays in the Garden of Gethsemane to be saved from having to be killed. But in John's Gospel, he specifically says in advance that he will not pray like that. John chapter 12, verse 27. And in John's Gospel, there was no time at which Jesus actually prays like that. Jesus in the 4th Gospel is deliberately going to the cross. John shows this in the following ways. 1, through John the Baptist's declaration. In Mark, John the Baptizer is baptizing people for the forgiveness of their sins. Jesus himself gets baptized. This leaves people to wonder if Jesus had sins. But in John's Gospel, it is not mentioned that Jesus was baptized. Rather, the baptizer calls out from a distance that Jesus is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. John chapter 1, verse 29. This is a clear evolution of the story. Second example of John evolving the story in the case of Judas. As Judas's mission, as Jesus's mission was to die for the sins of the world, and this is known from the beginning, Jesus's interaction with Judas is portrayed differently in John's Gospel. Here, Jesus gives Judas a morsel to eat, and immediately Satan enters into Judas. And then he at once goes out into the night to return with the arresting party. It would seem here that Jesus is engineering the course of his own crucifixion. A third example of how Jesus welcomes his death in John's Gospel. We have this in the way in which Jesus hands himself over. In Mark, Jesus kisses rather the other way around. Judas kisses Jesus to identify him for the arresting party. But in John, Jesus comes forward, announcing his identity. At the moment of his announcement, the arresting party fall backwards, as if blown away by Jesus' breath. In Mark, the disciples forsake Jesus and flee. In John, Jesus is handing himself over without protest, and he asks only that his disciples be let go. A fourth example of Jesus welcoming his death. Let me see my time here. So we're 8 minutes in. Okay. So in Mark, Jesus let out the famous cry, my God, why have you forsaken me?" In sharp contrast, in John, Jesus' last words are, "It is finished." John chapter 19, verse 30. So in Mark, it is like, why is this happening? Whereas in John, it is mission accomplished. So we see then that John has evolved the story to show that Jesus welcomed his death because he knew that that was the purpose from the very beginning. Now, John also wants to assure his readers of the certainty of Jesus' death. He does this in a number of ways. One, Jesus carried his own cross. In Mark, Simon of Cyrene was made to carry Jesus' cross. This led to a question in the minds of some readers as to whether or not Simon may have been crucified instead of Jesus. In John, however, Jesus carried his own cross, thus quashing the question. Two, the spear wound in the side of Jesus. As we go from the earliest to the latest gospel, the certainty that Jesus died increases. In Mark, Pilate wondered if Jesus had died so soon. But in John alone, we have the mention of the spear thrust in the side of Jesus, which Christian apologists cite usually as the fatal wound that killed Jesus. Third example of certifying the death of Jesus, the witnesses at the cross. In Mark, the female followers of Jesus were watching this scene from afar. In John, his mother and the beloved disciples are also there near the cross. John chapter 19, verse 25. Thus, John can boast that he has an eyewitness on the scene. John chapter 19, verse number 35. A fourth example of certifying the death of Jesus is through the binding for his burial. In Mark, Jesus was hurriedly wrapped in a cloth and placed in a tomb. If anyone had any doubt that Jesus was completely dead, however, John assures us that the body was bound in 75 pounds of aloes in accordance with Jewish customs. So if he wasn't dead already, maybe the wrappings would suffocate him. Okay, so those are four examples of John trying to show that Jesus' death was a certainty. He also does similar things to show that the resurrection was a certainty. And here are the following ways. One, Jesus appeared more times and in more places. In Mark, Mary Magdalene and the other women come to anoint the body of Jesus on the Sunday morning. They found the tomb open. The body was not there, but a young man in white garment assured them that Jesus was raised up. The young man directed them to go and tell the disciples to go to Galilee where they will see Jesus. The women fled from the tomb and said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Mark chapter 16, verse number 8. Thus, Mark ends in the most reliable manuscripts with the women fleeing from the tomb saying nothing to anybody. On the other hand, in John, Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene right in the garden in which the tomb was situated. Moreover, in John, Jesus appears twice to his disciples in Jerusalem before appearing to them in Galilee. A second way in which John certifies the death of Jesus is through the doubting Thomas doing the verification on our behalf. Let me look at my time. So 12, I have to keep going now. Okay, so the famous story of Thomas doubting and being invited to touch and examine Jesus' wounds is found only in John. So if anyone, after reading Mark, had any doubt that Jesus really was raised from the dead, John answers that doubt. In sum, John is in contrast with Mark, and he developed the storyline to assure his readers of the following points. One, Jesus was extremely willing to die on the cross. We saw this in the following ways, where A, John the Baptist declared him to be the Lamb of God who came to die for the sins of the world. B, Jesus refused to pray to be saved from death. C, Jesus gave Judas the spark that sent him off into the night to betray him. D, Jesus handed himself over to the arresting party when they could not have dared to arrest him. And finally, E, Jesus declared his death as mission accomplished. A second way in which John evolves the story is to show that Jesus' death by crucifixion was a certainty. He does that in the following ways. A, Jesus carried his own cross. B, Jesus suffered a spear wound. 3, there were witnesses, including Jesus' mother and the beloved disciple, near the cross. And D, Jesus' body was bound with 75 pounds of spices. A third issue for John and the way he evolved the gospel story was to show that Jesus' reappearance after his death was a certainty. We saw that in the following ways. A, Jesus appeared more times and in more places to more people in John. In Mark, there is a promise that Jesus will appear, but no story of his actually appearing. B, in John alone, we find the story of the doubting Thomas who was invited to touch Jesus' wounds. So we have seen that John improved the story in several important ways. Let me check my time to see how I need to wrap up my conclusion. Only a minute left. Moreover, we have seen that Matthew as well improved the story in significant ways. Matthew alone has the story about the dead saints coming to life and appearing to people in the city. Keeping my eye on the clock here. Thus, Matthew assures us of a major cosmic significance of Jesus' death. Matthew alone has the story of the guards at the tomb. With this story, Matthew seeks to assure us that there were witnesses to the resurrection and that no one stole the body. For lack of time, we have not looked much at Luke, but scholars have shown that Luke also improved the story in his own way. And Brother Yusuf has also shown that in many, many ways. In sum, each gospel after Mark improved the story to make it more Christian. And so, what are we to say about our topic? Does Markan priority imply that the message of Jesus has been changed and evolved? You bet. But I leave that for Rudolph to respond to, and I will come back to respond again later. Thank you all for your patient listening. Peace be with you all.
Thanks, Dr. Shabir. As you mentioned, we'll move on to the next opening statement, which is from Rudolph. So, Rudolph, I'll hand over to you.
Well, thank you so much, gentlemen. It's always good to speak about these things and get a little bit more clarity on what each person holds. Let me just start off and say directly, we've heard a lot about Markan priority and the fact that it does not imply that the text is reliable, but there's rather a theological evolution and a corruption of the historical Jesus. That's basically the claim. I'm going to stand on the other side of the fence, and I am looking at everybody's presentations, and I'm trying to add some different perspectives that I think we need to consider when in actual fact we speak about this central topical question. And I want to do so with a little bit of a different emphasis. I've just quickly adapted my outline just to make a few other claims. But let me just start off and speak about the claim of theological evolution. And Yusuf has mentioned that scholars, especially aligned with the Ehrman Bauer trajectory, they usually suggest that teleological evolution, especially of Christology. And so there are various ways in which people use or make use of Markan priority to explain different avenues in the gospel to show that there was embellishment. But let me just start off and say that when we look at that model, first of all, it's not the only model, but for the sake of this conversation, we agreed upon on speaking about this model. It severely mistreats the Gospel of Mark, especially. And for instance, when we look at the Christology that was earlier mentioned, it actually reduces what we can call the highest Christology. What I also want to do is just look at some of what we can say about the earliest Christians in the oral formulaic communities that maintained oral history. That might add a little bit more of a context to the overall conversation. And then also, what is the nature and the understanding of the biographies that we look at, especially when we speak about ancient biographies. And then maybe we can also look at a few other things, but as my time fleets, we can look at those things. But let me start off with the first one, the earlier high Christology of Mark. One way to show that Matthew and Luke allowed the image of Jesus to evolve is to claim, obviously, that the Gospel of Mark has a low view of Jesus and it was later elevated. But that is simply not the case, because as we see, and there's specific scholars like Richard Hayes and his Echoes and Scriptures in the Gospels, Martin Hengel, these guys have been mentioned in previous conversations. That shows us that the Christology of Mark is exceptionally high, and it is presented through a Jewish scriptural matrix, rather, I believe, than through later Hellenistic philosophical categories. And when we look at and I'm just going to give a few examples for the sake of time. But if we look at, for instance, the beginning of Mark's Gospel, it reads as follows. It says, the beginning of the good news of Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. And what we see immediately is that Mark immediately implies or applies Isaiah 40 and Malachi 3 to Jesus. And when we look at those passages, we see in their original context, these passages describe, for instance, Yahweh himself returning to Zion. And Mark is telling us from verse 2 of that same chapter that the arrival of Jesus is the arrival of Israel's God. Now, this is just not just proleptic or given in a way where it merely says that God came on the scene, but it speaks of the person of Christ that would be precursed by a prophetic figure, which we believe to be John the Baptist. And that is the way Mark actually starts his gospel. But secondly, in Mark chapter 2, we can see quite clearly that he's then accused of blasphemy because he forgives sins. In Mark chapter 4, like you see, he calms the storms. We can see that it's usually echoing Psalm 107, I think, where it speaks of the fact that Yahweh only has that domain over the Arctic Sea. In Mark chapter 6, for instance, we can see that Jesus walks on water, and we can see quite clearly that that is a drawing in Mark's understanding of Job 9 verse 8, which states that God alone treads on the waves of the sea. And we can go on and on and on. In Mark 14:61 verse 64, Jesus declares quite clearly that he is the I am and depicts himself as the Son of Man from Daniel, which is chapter 7 of Daniel, verse 13 and 14, which practices that eternal dominion, which is only proportioned to Yahweh, which also draws, I think, from Psalm 110. And again, then there is this blasphemy charges against Jesus and his divine status. But not just that. The book in itself, at Jesus' crucifixion, in Mark chapter 15, 39, the centurion declares, truly this was the Son of God, sort of bookending the Gospel's theme that Mark started off with in the beginning. So this led scholars like Dr. Larry Hurtado, who I had the privilege of knowing, to say that with quite astonishment and quite persuasiveness, we can see that the earliest Christian sources onward represented very early on a belief that Jesus was divine. Now, I can go through the pre-Pauline creeds and hymns. I can show you quite clearly that the writings even before Mark in Paul's letters show a high Christology, for instance, in Philippians chapter 2, 6 to 11. But even Richard Balcom, which is a leading voice on this, says that the earliest Christology was the highest Christology. So that is very important for us to understand. Secondly, something else I just want to draw into the conversation is the understanding of the oral Formate communities and the earliest testimonies about Christ. Because nobody has really touched upon that. They've just touched upon the problems that Markan priority gives us, which is basically just one view. But yes, something to consider. Both of our communities believe that God spoke. Both of our communities believe that there are different instances given to different individuals that show a testimony or a witness about what was said. But when it comes to the first Christian community, we need to understand that R.V.G. Tasker, professor of New Testament exegesis at the University of London, for instance, speaks about this. He says, when we look at the four Gospels, he says the following. He says, when we look at the first Christian community, we need to understand that our faith today is bound to be conditioned by the four Gospels. But the first Christian community, the faith of the Christian church and community was independent of these written texts because they did not have them very early. So in other words, the earliest Christian community had a affirmed teaching, or what we would call a affirmed kerygma, which obviously was very dear to them, which they committed themselves to. Even F.F. Bruce says quite clearly that the book that was written in the end was actually a substitute, or a second best substitute for the spoken word. Michael J. Kruger says, for instance, that when we look at the literary or the orality of the earliest Christians, we must note with certainty that they already knew and heard it many a times exactly what was contained in the message about Christ, which we would call the Evangelion, and what was given by the earliest apostles in their preaching, which we would call the paradosis, or the earliest teaching of the faith. Graham Stanton even writes that the oral proclamation that spilled over into literary form was only secondary, and the first Christian community took with great joy and great consistency upon themselves to actually establish and know exactly what was given by Jesus. So this is all very interesting for us, and I don't want to go and bore you to infinitum with things like, for instance, Stanley Portier and his Sacred Tradition, and the other book of Richard B. Hayes, where he speaks of reading backwards, where they speak quite clearly of the consistency of what was handed over. All of these books, all of the New Testament agree, for instance, on certain things, which is actually very evident within the text. Richard Balcom, Tom Thatcher, Alan Kirk, Jens Scrotter, some of these scholars all conclude that just looking at the oral Formate community to the solidification of what Jesus actually said and did, we can actually be very sure that the New Testament authors captured the memory of Jesus with great accuracy. Now, obviously, when we look, and we can look at this a little bit later, we can then ask the question, why these adaptations? We usually hear that there's simply these changes, but I think that's oversimplifying what the authors have actually done. When we actually look at some of the central claims of these authors, we can see quite clearly that they attribute to the fact that Jesus, even supernaturally, would give them the ability to write exactly what he wants them to. And just looking at Mark's gospel, for instance, we can see that Jesus says quite clearly in Mark 13:31 that heaven and earth shall pass away, but his words will never pass away. For instance, in John 14:26, where Jesus speaks to his disciples, and he says to them that the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send to my name, he will teach you all things and remind you of everything that I've said. So we can see quite clearly that when we look at Christ's claims about his own words, he makes clear that it's true, it is essential, it's preserved, but it's also the words that he will give them, and obviously the testimony that will be derived from them, that they will relate then to the first Christian community. Now, then we need to ask the question, but what about this historical mechanism behind this formation of the gospel? And what about these differences between the synoptics? Because I think that's where the conversation is going, obviously. Well, why is there a difference in what we perceive between all of these gospels? And when we look specifically at the synoptics between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the wording or the reordering of events. Now, let me just start off and say, I am very keenly aware that our opponents might claim that this evidence shows a form of theological tampering. However, if we look at what classical scholars and ancient Greco-Roman biographies say, and if we look at scholarship, again, by scholars like Richard Burridge, a dear friend of mine, Craig Keener, we can show that it demonstrates that the ancient biographers were expected to select, adapt, and arrange their materials so it highlights specific characteristics of what they want to address when they speak about certain subjects. So Matthew, and Yusuf mentioned this earlier, writes to a Jewish audience, for instance, emphasizing that there is a fulfillment of the Torah. Luke writes to a Hellenistic audience, emphasizing the universal scope of salvation. So the fact that they edit Mark roughly shows that they are using these words for their own need and for what they want to communicate. So when we look at the transmission of the traditions, we can see quite clearly that the gospel stories in themselves, and I think Richard Balcom in his monumental work, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, which is just an absolute must read, he says that the gospel stories did not just float around like a theological game of telephone, and it was not known by unknown communities or anonymous communities. He shows quite emphatically that the gospel traditions were closely guarded by named living eyewitnesses. He calls them the tradents, until the time they were committed to writing. So again, Mark himself is historically linked to Papias, which is one of the earliest eyewitnesses of the Apostle Peter. Matthew, yes, we can say incorporates Mark, if you believe in Markan priority, but he adds his own witness and his own eyewitness traditions. But here's the thing. The stability of the core narrative, the passions, the ethical teachings, the kingdom proclamations, the work, the person of Jesus Christ is very well preserved, precisely because of the eyewitnesses, and because they were still present to ensure the tradition was not hijacked by what we call later evolutionary agendas. So if I can just include those few things in this conversation, I think in conclusion, we can say that Markan priority in and of itself it is not a liability for the historical reliability of the Gospels. I think if you want to take that lens and if you want to take the German view, it is an asset. It gives us a baseline to work from. But when we analyze that baseline, we do not find a simple peasant whose legends grew over time. We find the first century Jewish text that already identifies Jesus of Nazareth as the embodiment of Yahweh, returning to his people. We find the narrative rooted in historical space and time that is guarded by the eyewitnesses. And we see that there's the difference between the four Gospels. And they do not present the evolution of the message. They represent a multifaceted, stereoscopic view of the historical figure of Jesus that is not seen through a single theological framing. And why not? Because if there was a single theological framing, word for word, let me tell you, this discussion would look very different tonight. The claim would rather be, these guys have colluded, they've come together, and they've tried to source and put a story together to serve a common goal. But these authors obviously did not have that in mind. What they tried to do is to show a picture and to claim that the message of Jesus is sure. So I think the claim that the message evolved is to impose an anachronistic, modern skeptic view on ancient texts. And the message of Jesus, and especially the historical Jesus and his divine identity, his cross, his resurrection, all of these things remain steadfast, I believe, when we actually look at the text. So in all, maybe those four things that we can look at: the eyewitness testimony and ancient biography, the fact that Christ's perspectives on his own preservation of his words is sure and true, the fact that we can look at the earlier oral formulaic communities and their testimony, all of these things show us quite clearly, and the high Christology that I've mentioned, that the intention of the community was sure. And I think they made those points and they actually accomplished that task. And I'll leave you there.
Thanks, Rudolph. Thanks for your opening statement. We're going to move now into the time of rebuttals, and each rebuttal will be 8 minutes each. And Yusuf, we will start with your rebuttal to kick us off.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to both Rudolph, Shabir, and Samuel. Just to start off with the thing, in the limited time I've got, Mark chapter 1. I think both of you cited Mark 1 as a kind of an indication of probably a more pronounced Christology. Basically, it's something where he quotes, "It is written in Isaiah the prophet, I will send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way." And he says that this is from what I can understand, that this is Isaiah, or that there's a reference to this as being as it is written in the book of Isaiah, something along that line. Now, there's 2 points. Is that when you look at the footnotes of the gospel pointed to Malachi, that this actual reference, the first half of the citation, is Malachi and not Isaiah. But in actual fact, when you look at it further, it's not even in Malachi chapter 3, verse 1, which is generally the citation, but it's in Exodus chapter 23, verse 20, where you have a passage which says, "I'm going to send an angel in front of you." What I did was I looked at the Greek Septuagint in Bible Hub. You go and check the Greek Septuagint, and you look at Exodus chapter 3, verse 23, verse 20, and you look at Mark chapter 1, verse 2, and you see that the passages are exactly identical. In Exodus, in the Septuagint, it's edu apostolou ton angelon mo pro prosopouso, whereas in Mark 1, 2, it's edu apostolou ton angelon mo pro prosopouso. Forgive me if I butchered the Greek language, but that's a near verbatim agreement between the two texts, whereas there's a less verbatim agreement between Malachi chapter 3, verse 1, which is edu ego exapostelo to angelon mu. So because verse 2 begins with the citation of Exodus chapter 23, verse 20, and not Malachi, saying that this is in fact indication of a high Christology is actually erroneous, because in Exodus, in context, if Mark is appropriating it but wrongly attributing it to Isaiah, Yahweh is speaking to Israel during the Exodus, declaring that he would send his angel or the messenger before them on a journey. Mark appropriates his words and he applies them to Jesus, but says that he takes them from Isaiah. Now, the point is that you've got a composite citation here, 3 separate sources, 2 of which are not Isaiah, nor the attribution of them all to Isaiah itself. And that can't be accidental, because Mark in general quotes from the book of Isaiah many times, I think something like 8 times, and there's Isaiah motifs strongly influence the Markan narrative, but he does it incorrectly. He does it basically incorrectly. The other point is that prior to verse 3, there's a natural and what they call in Greek antecedent of his, O2 is Lord, in the same verse. The translators of the Septuagint routinely, and many occasions, they utilize the name Yahweh with Kyrios, but in doing so, they create some sort of ambiguity, because the word Kyrios can also be referring to anyone that's superior to anyone else, a master, not necessarily identification of Kyrios with Yahweh. So had Mark intended to communicate that the word Kyrios in verse 3 was in fact God, he could have done so by leaving the language identical to the Septuagint. But the fact that there's a deliberate alteration in the passage suggests that he is inferentially creating the distance from Jesus and divinity itself. Samuel quoted, for example, Mark 12, the story about, why do the teachers of the Lord say that the Messiah is the son of David? David himself speaking about the Spirit saying, the Lord said on my Lord, until I put your enemies under your feet. David himself calls him Lord. How can he then be his son? But many people point out that Psalm 110 is not a messianic prophecy and does not refer to Jesus. But even if it does refer to Jesus, if Mark or Matthew, anyone else appropriated, the second Lord in Psalms is Adoni. And Adoni, my master, which is translated as Lord, is never used to refer to God in the Bible, but to kings and authorities. Christian translators intentionally capitalize Lord in both places to create a kind of a false impression that Yahweh is speaking to the Messiah. But in actual fact, Adoni does not mean God in any kind of divine cosmic sense. Rudolph points out the aspect of the prophecy in Daniel in Mark 14:61. When asked if Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed, he affirms and he says, the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, you'll see him coming from the clouds of heaven. If you look at Daniel, sitting at the God's right hand signifies a kind of a co-rulership with God, something that was inherent to the reign of the Israelite king. There's God in the heaven, there's the reign on earth. And coming with the clouds of heaven doesn't signify divinity than in the original context of Daniel chapter 7, where the Son of Man comes on the clouds and is presented to God. So if the Son of Man is presented to God, how can he be God? Jesus is not saying in that context that he's a divine judge. He's basically claiming vindication, that although he's mocked and judged now, he would be exalted at the end when God's reign finally breaks through. So I don't know how you can make the argument that from that perspective, this is somehow or the other an indication of a higher Christology. Samuel started off with the whole issue about the storm, which we discussed in the last debate itself. If you look at the discussions on this, for example, the Pelican New Testament commentaries by J.C. Fenton or Robert Gundry in his discussion on Matthew, the commentary on his literary and theological art, they both make the point that there's clearly a change. It's not just you see what Samuel's trying to say, that there's the emphasis on teacher and there's a mention of Lord, and somehow the other teacher is also used in the later Gospels and Lord is used, and there's an interchangeable usage of the term. We are aware of that point, but the problem you basically find here is that there is a rebuke on the one instance, which is changed to a prayer. When you are saying, teacher, do you not care or have any kind of consideration that we are drowning, to Lord, save us, it's not just an emphasis on the utilization of titles, it's also a rebuke that is basically changed to a prayer. So if there is no developed Christology in terms of how Jesus is presented, why would Matthew change the rebuke which exists in Mark to that of a prayer, and why would he remove the rebuke? So the fact that there you've got these similar titles like Rabbi, Teacher, Lord, doesn't imply kind of a lack of Christology, but rather basically illustrates a layered, complex way in which the earlier followers and the gospel writers recognized Jesus' identity, but there was a greater degree of emphasis in terms of how these titles were used in the later gospels. So, for example, the word Kyrios, Lord, in Mark, it presents a kind of a master-servant relationship. But in the later gospels, for example, and even the writings of Paul, that title quickly took on a divine connotation, like in Philippians. The issue of, for example, a teacher. Yes, he's used as a teacher in all the gospels, but in the later gospels, he's not just simply recognized as a teacher, he's recognized as something as more than a teacher. So quite clearly you can see that whilst the titles, there's an interchangeable usage of the titles, there's clearly a progressive recognition that the titles, in terms of how they present Jesus, evolve based on the context of how they're presented in the various gospels. And the later you go through the gospels, the more pronounced they become. And I think my time is unfortunately gone. I couldn't deal with some of the other points. Thank you. Thanks,
Yusuf. We'll move on to Reverend Samuel for your rebuttal of 8 minutes. Over to you.
Thank you for that, Yusuf. I will reply to both Yusuf and Shabir and just make some brief comments in reply there. In your presentation, you were talking about how in Mark, Jesus doesn't know the hour. And so I just want to say yes. And as I pointed out in my presentation, that's the case also in Matthew and Luke. And so that doesn't show a progression. It just shows, it actually shows a faithful putting in and a faithful continuation and a similar Christology. You mentioned Mark 6:5 and Matthew 13:58, where Jesus goes to his hometown and it says he wasn't able to do many miracles because of their lack of faith. In both, it says it was their lack of faith as to why he didn't do it. So these are not really changing the story. They're just retelling it or actually passing it on. I don't see how you can use that as an example. You spoke of in Matthew, he talks about Emmanuel and the others don't. Well, yes, that's right. There are distinctives for each gospel. So we can't just use Matthew's use of Emmanuel from Isaiah 7 and say, well, that's not elsewhere. And so that's a development. As I showed from Isaiah 40 and Malachi 3, and you mentioned that it's not Malachi 3, it is Malachi 3, and it's not Exodus 23:20. This is confirmed in Malachi 4, verse 3, where it says it's not an angel who's coming, but it's Isaiah. It's Isaiah. So you can't use Exodus 23:20 because if you keep reading in Malachi, it's Isaiah is, Elijah is coming back. Elijah is coming back, and there's going to be this Elijah figure, and that is identified as John the Baptist. So it is Isaiah 40 at the start of Mark, and it is Malachi 3, and that's just how it is. I mentioned, if you want to be consistent with this, then you've got the problem of the virgin birth, because if you want to say the virgin birth is how they're embellishing the story and developing everything, well, the Quran has this. And so the Quran seems to accept this aspect of the gospel. You spoke about on the storm, and you said that there are these different responses in the storm. I would say yes. I'm going to come to this in a moment when I look at how the gospels complement each other. Yes, there are different responses there, but that's also because there's at least 12 other people on the boat. And I assume there's a range of responses to what's happening. And so this simply may be evidence of the fact that this is coming from a body of testimonial evidence that's being passed on by the witnesses. As I said at the beginning, that there's a team of people from which these gospels come, and each one is free as an apostle of Jesus to use this information for a new expression. What have I got here? You said that Jesus was ignorant when the woman touched him, the woman with bleeding. He's ignorant in Mark's gospel, but in Matthew, he's not ignorant and he knows. But Matthew also has Jesus not knowing the hour, so you can't draw that conclusion because it still has him not knowing certain things. It's just a slightly different retelling of exactly the same event. And this is what I'm going to come back to, that these are all exactly the same events, just with different details emphasizing different things. There was different descriptions of the transfiguration, but again, they're all these glorified visions of Jesus. What have I got here? The fig tree withering. Again, we've still got exactly the same event happening. It's just one's giving you an immediate response, an immediate description. Another is talking about it the next day when they come back into the town and come back to that description. So I just don't see any issue here. And again, we're not changing the events that happened. We're just getting complementary information to this. I want to quickly look at Shabir's points. I just wanted to particularly look, because I've only got 3 minutes, to look at your comparison between Mark and John. And I wanted to point out what scholars note between Mark and John, and that is that John definitely seems to be wanting to deliberately complement the earlier Gospels. And what I mean by that is we see this in chapter 1, verse 24, where it says this is before John was put in prison. And you wouldn't even need to think about that question unless you'd read the Gospels, unless you'd read Matthew, Mark, or Luke. And so John puts this in there to help you get your chronology right if you've got the synoptic chronology. So he's complementing them. We see this again in chapter 11, verse 12, where it says, this is the Mary who anointed Jesus' feet. Now, why do you need to point that out? Well, it's because we know that from the synoptics. And so John is actually bringing this synoptic idea into it. And so we see that the Gospels are actually, well, at least with John, and I would want to say we can project this to Matthew and Mark as well, that they are consciously trying to complement each other and give extra information that may not be in another one. We can see that deliberately spelt out in John. And I want to say that this is what we also see in Luke. And so you gave many illustrations of Mark just has this, but John has more detail. And there's this in Mark, but Mark gives more detail about Judas and exactly what happened there. I want to say yes to all of that, but I want to say John is actually wanting to complement these things. And again, and I'll finish up with this point, that they're not improving the story, they're just giving complementary information. Jesus is still the Christ. He's still dying for our sins. He's still healing people. He's still being resurrected from the dead. All the big planks of the story, as I pointed out in my presentation, are there in all of them. It's just that as the Gospels go on, as there are later Gospels, it seems that more information is given to complement them. Although sometimes Matthew and Luke truncate a story to take away detail, so it's not always that way. But you know, I think to prove your point, you need to prove one says Jesus is just a man and the other says he's God, or you need to show he didn't die on the cross and he did, or he didn't resurrect and he did, because it seems that you're trying to bring out those by inference, that there's this big theological development, but it's not a theological development. It's a development of complementary details to the same events. And so I just don't see the Gospels developing in this theological sense. I'm prepared to admit that they're developing in a giving of details, but that's okay because that seems to be what they want to do. They come later, and as I pointed out with John, he is wanting to complement them. So the apostles can do this. There's no problem there. So I'll finish up there.
Thanks very much, Samuel. I'm going to move to Dr. Shabir for your 8-minute rebuttal.
Sure. Thank you, gentlemen. You've all spoken very well. And Reverend Samuel, you've given us a lot to think about, especially in your response to what Yusuf and I have said. Let me, ladies and gentlemen, recap some of the points that I made in my opening presentation so that we can see from that how the responses have been adequate or inadequate to what I have presented. I have shown that John, in contrast with Mark, developed the storyline to assure his readers of the following points. One, that Jesus was extremely willing to die on the cross. We saw this in the following ways, that A, John the Baptist declared him to be the Lamb of God who came to die for the sins of the world. B, that Jesus refused to pray to be saved from death. C, that Jesus gave Judas the spark that set him off on the mission to betray him. And D, Jesus handed himself over to the arresting party when they could not have dared to arrest him. And E, finally, that Jesus declared his death as mission accomplished. The second way in which John is developing the story is to show that Jesus' death by crucifixion was a certainty. We saw this in the following ways. A, that Jesus carried his own cross so that one could not think that Simon the Cyrene may have been crucified instead. B, Jesus suffered a spear wound. So if we ask what killed Jesus, the Christian apologists will say, the spear wound. But scholars generally think that this is not historical. C, that there were eyewitnesses in John's gospel who included Jesus's mother and the beloved disciple who were near the cross, whereas in Mark, there were women who had followed Jesus and they were from afar, seeing what happened. So they could not see so very clearly, one might say. And D, that Jesus's body was bound with 75 pounds of spices. So you might think that even if he wasn't dead on the cross, maybe the spices will suffocate him, or at least the wrappings. The third way in which I've shown that John evolved the story by comparison with Mark is that in John, Jesus's reappearance after death was, for John, more certain. We saw this in the following ways. A, that Jesus appeared more times in more places to more people. In Mark, there is a promise that Jesus will appear, but no story of his actually appearing. In John alone, we find the story. This is B. In John alone, we find the story of the doubting Thomas, who was invited to touch Jesus's wounds. Now, I want to make a further point about this in conclusion that I didn't have a chance to say in my opening presentation. We have seen how John has evolved the story of as he found it in Mark, and Reverend Samuel has agreed that John is using the previous Gospels, but he is giving his own gospel as a complement to what the others have already written. So now, knowing what the earlier gospels have already written, and John is evolving the story as we have seen in these ways, think about the timeline. Jesus is said to have been raised up into heaven around the year 30, and Mark's gospel is said to have been written around the year 70, according to what most scholars believe. And John's gospel by the end of the first century, around the year 100. So from Mark to John, there is the expiration of about 30 years, 3 decades. Now, from Jesus's ascension to the writing of Mark's gospel, there are 4 decades. So if the story improved in John's gospel within those 3 decades as compared with Mark, you can imagine how much the story might have evolved from Jesus to Mark as well in the 4 decades. So we should not take Mark as, because Mark has said it, therefore it's in all of the Gospels. This is a common response we have found from both Rudolph and Reverend Samuel, that, okay, the Christology is high in all of the Gospels, or all of the Gospels say he's Lord, all of the Gospels say he died, and so on. But we have to ask, okay, if John evolved the story from Mark, as he did, how did Mark evolve the story from Jesus? That John Bowden, in his book, Jesus, the Unanswered Questions, has actually made this point. He said that we can see that Mark was improved in Matthew and Luke, because we see Mark, we see the source, and we see Matthew and Luke and how they compare. But we cannot see Mark's sources. But if we could see Mark's sources, we would find, according to John Bowden, that Mark has already improved his sources. So Mark as well is a theological account. It's not a simple history of what went below. So to say that, okay, Mark has a high Christology as well, that is not to be disputed, but it is to now have us go back through the timeline and say, what was Jesus's own Christology? What did Jesus think about himself? Reverend Samuel says, well, if we had in one gospel, he's not God, and the other one, he is God. But look at Mark chapter 10, where Jesus says, why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone. He's clearly contrasting himself with God. And in Matthew's gospel, it's changed to, why do you ask me about what is good? So the contrast is no longer there, like the denial that is there in Mark's gospel is not there in Matthew. True, some things are repeated in Matthew. Like Mark says, Jesus said, he does not know when the hour will occur. Matthew repeats the same thing. Curiously, Reverend Green said that it's also in Luke, but it's not in Luke. Anyway, okay, it's in Matthew. As I've said in my opening presentation, not all of the Gospels improve the stories in all of the ways. Some improvements are in some ways, some are not. At one point, Reverend Samuel said, but sometimes the evolution seems to go backwards. And he mentioned the story of forgiving the paralytic. But in fact, when you read the story, you see that the overall thrust of the story is basically the same. Only God can forgive sins. And Matthew concludes by saying that the people praise God who has given such authority to men. So in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there is a micro-evolution from Mark to Matthew and Luke. But in John, there is a macro-evolution. Reverend Green just passed over the problem of John's Gospel depicting Jesus as the Logos. Well, that's not a minor thing. That's a major thing. And the fact that this is not not mentioned in previous Gospels, this is really a major evolution. This is a macro evolution of the Gospel story about Jesus. So I rest my case. Thank you all very much for listening. Oh, I have another minute, do I, Dave?
You do indeed, if you would like to use it.
Let me take up that for another minute. Let me mention a few more points. So Reverend Green says, "Oh, but they're in the storm. There are different responses. So that would mean some people responded one way, some responded another way. One gospel, captured one response. The other gospel captured the other response. Well, this is not how you write the story. If you're writing a précis, you should give us like the overall response. And here we find in Mark's gospel, the overall response is that the people are indignant, like are you asleep and don't you care about us? And in the other gospel, they say, Lord, save us. So this is something entirely different. And it's not just capturing one and capturing the other. It's an evolution in the story as we go from Mark to Matthew. So I thank you all again.
Thanks, Dr. Shabir. We'll move into our final rebuttal, which is from your side, Rudolph. So over to you for your 8 minutes.
Well, guys, thank you so much. Again, like I said, this conversation is something we can learn from and something we can definitely take to heart. Let us just look quickly at the types of stylistic writing, because I think this is also going to be very interesting to look at that, because we need to be very, very, I almost want to say careful when we identify what scholars identify as first century historiographic techniques. And the reason for that is simply we cannot impose a Harvard-style selection of ideas in writing these biographies and impose it upon the first century historiography and the techniques that were utilized. So let me just give you some of these types of stylistic writings. For instance, telescoping, which is compressing. This is probably one of the most common techniques where the author shortens a narrative to focus specifically on a point that was given, right? We, for instance, heard the example of the cursing of the fig tree in Mark chapter 11. I think it's from verse 12 to 20. And then in Matthew's gospel, it was also mentioned in chapter 21 that, we see that there's a definite, the roots, Matthew said, with it from that very moment where Mark maybe adjusted that this happened a little bit later. Greg Blomberg notes that ancient biography, especially when they look at certain narratives, especially like this, when they actually write it and when they actually look at it, what we can see is that there is a prioritization of what is known as the theological impact of the event. So Matthew isn't fixing a mistake. He's simply streamlining the point because of what is given, for instance, in Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah, to show that God is cutting off Israel. So there's other things at play. And it's not just the story that is given to show its theological impact, but it's showing that he's not using a comparison which is directly related to the very details of Mark. He's rather making statements to serve the exact theological point that he is trying to make in that context. So that is very, very important. Here's another one that we can look at, thematic redaction, where authors reword sayings, for instance, to fit their own specific audience vocabulary. Now, this is something that happens very often in the first century, right? For instance, when we've heard this again in, for instance, Mark's gospel, the rich young rulers, in his account, where Jesus asked, "Why do you call me good?" The accusation was given that in Matthew 19, 17, the words is then given, "Why ask me about what is good?" And therefore there's this discrepancy. Mark Goodacre, because he was mentioned as well, and by the way, he wrote an excellent book recently on Matthew and John, which is very good to read as well. But he shows that this is simply known as editorial fatigue, or what we would call a stylistic preference for clarity. So it does not, here's the thing, guys, it does not change the core historical encounter of the event. It adapts the actual dialogue for a specific purpose. And so this is often used in especially first century documents. It's not just in the Gospels. It is everywhere. And Timothy Paul Jones speaks, and he mentions linguistic updates, where, for instance, the standard for the authors in their writing is to impact a specific motif in emphasizing a historical truth. So I think these techniques should not be minimalized, and we should not impose modern ideas upon the text, and we should not misunderstand, for instance, these techniques, because once we do so, we will definitely just create a confusion. Here's another one. And this is sometimes known, for instance, as the anonymity of evolution fallacy, where we, for instance, say, when we speak about the topic of Christology, we heard it says that, yes, Matthew and Luke is basically improving upon Mark, so there's a high Christology. But here again, guys, the Bible is not a singular book nor four books, and I don't want to go outside of the synoptics. But again, like I said, the earliest writings already show a high Christology. We cannot say that there's an invention in Mark's Gospel, which is probably written after the Pauline corpus. And for instance, when we look at Philippians chapter 2, 6-11, we cannot not speak about that. So we need to understand that there's an overall context, and any scripture without context should be seen as pretext. So all of these things again play in upon why and how we read the text. Here's another one, what is known as the contradictory fallacy, especially when it comes to the early reading of the text. Shabir points out that the God at the tomb in Matthew could have been a late embellishment to fix, for instance, the weakness of Mark. I'm just summing it up. Don't want to put words in his mouth. Watch the debate. But this is misunderstanding what is known as source selection. Okay, this is what they would do. They would select certain sources. For instance, Matthew isn't inventing a God. He's simply including a historical traditional that is relevant to the Jewish audience to, for instance, answer what was known in the known day about the stolen day or the stolen body polemic that circulated in Jerusalem, right? And scholar John Rust, for instance, says that the independence of the sources in actual fact allows for the different historical details to be preserved in these communities, because every single author in the gospel is trying to speak to an immediate community. So there's not a contradiction of the facts. There's simply an understanding of the sources that are selected to specifically refute or enlighten a specific polemic that is circulating. So again, here's the question in my last minute. Why are these literary devices important? Well, they are important because when we read these texts, and we do not read it with a skeptical lens, but we try to say, listen, there might be different elements that might be critical in these gospels. They are there, but the differences in actual fact, and these independent verifications shows, like I said, that there is no collusion. I would say that there is minor disagreements, and there's stylistic variations. And this is what is a hallmark of independent eyewitness testimony. That is exactly what Greg Blomberg speaks of. That is exactly, in fact, what we find within the text. But the historical core of these writings and the core historical facts, the fact that Jesus died on a cross, is probably one of the most well-attested events in history. Even Gerd Ludemann speaks quite clearly, and then he uses, Gerd Ludemann speaks, for instance, of 1 Corinthians 15, and he says, here in this passage, it shows quite clearly the ascension of Christ, that he came down with a specific motive to die on a cross, and he says this saying is quoted by Paul, and it falls within 2 to 3 years of the actual church and the history. So ancient standards, again, like I said, we should maintain when we're reading these documents for the sake of the documents themselves. And I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Rudolph. We're going to move now into a time of cross-examination. And so we'll begin with the Muslim side asking the Christian side questions for 15 minutes. So I'm going to hand over to Dr. Shabir and Yusuf to decide on how best to structure that time in terms of asking questions.
Go ahead, Yusuf. You can start.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Samuel, just before we had this break, the question I wanted to ask: do you accept the principle that if you look at Exodus chapter 23, verse 20 to 21, generally most Jewish commentators basically understand that God is going to send an angel to guard the Israelites on their way and bring them into the promised land? And amongst the traditional Jewish commentators, it's not been interpreted as a coming of the Lord in the sense of a physical appearance of a Messiah. Do you actually accept that's generally been the Jewish consensus?
Yeah. Well, I am not. Thank you for the question. I'm not familiar with all Jewish commentaries on Exodus 20, whichever verse it was. Sorry. But yeah, so that's the angel of the Lord coming on the way. And as far as I know, I accept that what you've said is correct. I just don't accept that that's what's being quoted in Mark chapter 1.
Yeah, so that's going to take me to this. You see, Mark mentions at the commencement that basically what he's taking is he's taking from Isaiah, but in actual fact, according to you and according to a lot of footnotes, it's Malachi chapter 3, verse 1. My point was that Mark was actually quoting from Exodus chapter 23, verse 20, and not Malachi chapter 3, verse 1, because Mark was obviously using the Greek Septuagint. So my question is, why do you reject that premise?
Well, I reject the premise because, first of all, it is a quote from Isaiah 40. Isaiah 40 and Malachi 3 both have the idea of the Lord is coming and there is someone who's going to announce his coming. And so both Isaiah have this and Malachi have it. He only attributes it to Isaiah the prophet, but he's just gathered similar prophecies together and just said the first one.
I accept that, but I don't want to take too much of time. What you have here is a kind of a sandwiching technique where you've got a combination of Old Testament text. Now, the point I'm making is that the first half of the citation, which is cited as verse 2, most people assume that is in fact in reference to Malachi chapter 3, verse 1. I'm going to send an angel in front of you. But that in actual fact is a direct taking from Exodus chapter 23, verse 20, and not from Malachi. You said it comes from Malachi. It actually comes from Exodus chapter 23, verse 20.
I don't. Okay.
Well, let me just give you an example. Dave, can you just put up the screen? Dave, can you share my screen here? Can you just share the screen, Dave? I've given something for you to share. If you can just share the screen that I've got in front of me. Can you just share the screen? Yeah. If you look at the screen there, right now, I've just looked at this. If you look at Brenton's Septuagint, the translation, and I've got the transliteration here. In Exodus chapter 23, verse 20, directly, it's from, combining it with Mark, it's idu ego apostolo ton angelon mopu prosopu, meaning I will send my messenger before your face. In Mark chapter 1, verse 2, it's again, idu ego apostolo ton angelon mo prosopu so, meaning I will send my angel before your face. That's Malachi doesn't have that as all. So Mark is actually taking directly from Exodus chapter 23, verse 20, and he's not quoting from Malachi and then wrongly attributing it to Isaiah. And the point I'm making is that Exodus chapter 23, verse 20 was not in any way a kind of a reference to this messianic figure, or some sort of divine representation. Most of the Jews basically identified just simply as an angel, and not in any way.
Can I hop in here?
But my point I'm saying is that why is there a misrepresentation here? Because it's not from Malachi. It's directly from that portion's from Exodus.
Can you please? I've got two things. So, first of all, I'd like to see the Greek for Malachi. So that'd be interesting to see what that says.
Yeah.
Because without comparing it to Malachi, I can't say. But secondly, even if I take your view, when you keep reading in Mark, it's saying that the messenger is John the Baptist, and the one that is coming before his face is the Lord. So even if we take it as a quote from Exodus, it's still positioning Jesus as the Lord and the one who comes before him as John. So it confirms the Christian position either way. But you've raised an important point, but I'd like to look at Malachi as well.
Yeah, well, the point I'm saying is that what the Markan gospel is effectively presenting, if you look at it from that perspective, that's from Exodus, the Markan gospel is basically then saying that this is a kind of a new Exodus involving both John the Baptist as a messenger and Jesus as a kind of a new Moses that's basically arriving on the scene. Because had Mark intended to communicate the idea, which I think both you and Rudolph was making, that, that kind of kyrios, or the Lord in verse 3, somehow or the other God, he could have done it by kind of leaving the language of the Septuagint intact. But you've got your kind of a deliberate alteration, and you've got a kind of a triple combining of texts, and where people even assume that it's in reference to Malachi, that actual portion of the verse which is in reference to Malachi is not in it's not a duplication of Malachi. Rather, it's a duplication exactly of what is found in Exodus chapter 23, verse 20. There's a similarity to Malachi, but it's actually different. So I'm saying that Mark is appropriating what is found in the book of Exodus, and he's making another point, which is that this is now a new messenger, and John the Baptist, and he's heralding a kind of a new Moses on the scene. So to assume, based on that this is a kind of a high Christology is basically erroneous, because in Exodus, Yahweh is speaking about Israel during the Exodus, and he would send the angel before them on their journey. And Mark appropriates his words, applies them to Jesus, but then he says he takes it from Isaiah. So it's quite clear that there's some form of confusion here on the right of Mark.
Okay, hang on. So, well, I'm meant to be answering the questions, and you need to let me answer.
All right.
It most certainly is a quote from Isaiah as well. There's no doubt about that. The voice of one calling in the desert, prepare the way for the Lord, make a straight path for him. That is Isaiah 40. That's just what it is. Now, I take your point, and that was very interesting. So I've learned something here today with the quote from Exodus. I think it was 24, you said. But as I said,
Exodus 23:20, yeah.
20. Even if I take that, and then the way that Mark is applying that to Jesus, John is the messenger in that. So if we take that verse and say Mark is now using that to describe Jesus and John the Baptist, well, John the Baptist is the one preparing the way for Jesus, and so Jesus becomes the Lord from that. So either way, you still get a high Christology.
No, but he's not using the word kyrios in the sense that he's attempting to compare it with Yahweh. He's not using it in that sense. He's using the word kyrios of a different kind. And if you're referencing Isaiah 43, the only thing in Isaiah 43 is a voice of one crying in the wilderness.
Rudolph, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Yusuf, I want to affirm what you say, and then I also want to refute what you say. So let me give you the theological perspective. I agree 100% with you that when you quote Daniel 7:13, in ancient Near Eastern context, sitting at the right hand of God could mean that it's a monarch or king, like you said, that shared the authority or divine status. No doubt. You can fend for that. Unitarians love that. That's great. But when you look at the Son of Man imagery, where Jesus also speaks quite clearly, and he says he's riding on the clouds, that prerogative alone, according to Psalm 104:3 and Isaiah 9 verse 1, is reserved to Yahweh alone. And the interesting thing is if you look at the reaction of the high priest in Mark 14:62-64, the reaction immediately was one that he tore his robes because he believed that there was a commitment of blasphemy. So that is the distinction. Yes, there is both the royal depiction of the one that's been handed the authority. No doubt that is synonymous with some of the readings of Jesus taking authority and practicing that authority as the perfect man. But the one that rides the clouds, the one that is seated on the throne of heaven, putting those two together, is placing Jesus on the same level as Yahweh. And that is why he was crucified. That is in actual fact the climatic point of the whole point, the whole reading of what was said in Mark's gospel, is that Jesus then dies on the cross because of blasphemy.
Let me just reply to that.
Both those two are evident in the text.
Yeah, let me just reply to the aspect of Daniel coming with the clouds of heaven, right? It no more signifies divinity than it did in the original context, because if you look at the context of Daniel 7:13, the Son of Man comes to the cloud. He just doesn't simply come on the clouds, but he's presented to God. So Jesus is not saying he is a divine judge. He's claiming vindication. But if he is God, how can God be presented to God? Here the Son of Man is being presented to God. The other point which you reference about, I think it's Mark 14:55, where I think the priest basically asks the question. He says, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed?" Are you? In form, the priest's question basically, Peter's words are a statement of belief, but the high priest's statement where he says, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed?" is a statement of unbelief. It basically also reveals that as far as the high priest was concerned, to be the whole Christos, the Messiah, was to be the Son of the Blessed One, the Hohios to Egelotu. It's simply that. It's a Son of God. Now, given what we know about
Yusuf, do you have a question there? Because obviously you're asking.
Okay, here's a question. Most of the early scholars, if you're saying that it's in reference to the high divinity of Christ, most of the early scholars like E.P. Sanders argue that the Son of God is a high designation, but you can't go beyond that. So how do you come to the conclusion that this designation, which is used in a very human sense, in a messianic sense, could somehow or the other be connected to him being divine in the absolute sense? That would be my question.
Yeah,
Shabir, if you want to take over? Yeah.
Sure. If I can answer quickly, I think most skeptics argue that when, especially in Mark's gospel, it's not Son of God. The title that is used is Son of Man, right? And they believe it's a circumlocution for a man like me or this man. That is what skeptics would say. But the difficulty with that, though, is that these are categories given that is not universally accepted by the gospel writers when they draw upon, for instance, the Old Testament text. So when they draw, for instance, from the story that is given in Daniel's vision, so we see that this vision is given from the one that's coming from the clouds of heaven. They are deriving what they are writing about to show quite clearly that, like I said, from the Old Testament text, the understanding of the Old Testament text is showing that, yes, he is that viceroyal servant that is obviously predicted and depicted in this gospel. But there is something more to him. And that is something I think that Mark is trying to show right throughout his gospel. And that is exactly what I said in just here in my presentation. Mark chapter 2. Mark is showing slightly Jesus forgives sins. Mark 4, he calms the storms. Mark 6. And by the way, that calming of the storm echoes Psalms 107. So Mark is using the Old Testament. Mark chapter 6, where he walks on the water, prefigures another theophanic echo in Job chapter 9:8. Mark 14, ego eimi statements. Mark 15, the centurion then renounces or announces in Mark 15:39. And like I said, this is sort of a bookend to the Gospel of Mark. Truly, this man was the Son of God, which we something, especially from a Greek mindset and a Roman mindset, something blasphemous, which means totally different. Mark is recording something that is showing us that there is this immediate fulfillment of Isaiah 40 and Malachi chapter 3. And it's in its original context, like Samuel said, he is showing that it's Yahweh himself returning to Zion.
Rudolph, just I have to just stop you there. If that is the case, and given what we know about Messianism in the Second Temple period, are you saying that it's plausible that the high priest, when he asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed?" When the high priest was asking him that, was he anticipating the coming of the Messiah to be the coming of God himself? Because that's what you're basically inferring. If that is the argument, then you are saying that the high priest is asking him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" He's asking him, "Are you the Messiah? Are you God Almighty?" that's never been the position in the Second Temple Judaism. It's never been the case where the Messiah has been equated to God. Yet that would be your position if you were to adopt that point of view, and you'd be inferring that would be the position of the high priest when he was asking him the question, "Are you the Son of the Blessed One?" Meaning, are you God Himself? That's ludicrous. How can we jump?
Can Rudolph
sure.
reply there, Yusuf?
Yeah.
Yeah, there are instances.
Dave, can you please take the quote off the screen?
Yeah,
okay, sure. Let me take it off the screen.
Perfect.
Shabir, if you want to come in as well, I've been
Actually, our time is up,
no.
so that's okay. Let Rudolph answer, and then
Sure.
All right.
Let me answer. It is very interesting, and I can give you the direct scriptures. But for instance, in Jeremiah 23, there's a few other passages very early on in the Old Testament specifically, where we can see these embers of the divine Messiah. It is quite a broad speculation, but it is something that is out there and something that can be affirmed in the Old Testament, yes.
Yeah, but just one point. Son of man, son of God in the Old Testament, always human. Always human.
Always human, but it does not refute the fact that there are instances where the messianic figure is depicted as divine. Again, Unitarians know. Unitarians would, for instance, dispute this and say, yes, but God in a representational way, not God in an actual sense, and they've got all these arguments. The problem with that is very simply is that when you read the Hebrew text, you see quite clearly that, no, it is a explicit understanding of the divine Messiah.
So last point, and
I'm going to move on to the next.
Okay.
I'm going to move on to swap into the next part of the cross-examination, and I'll add an extra minute on there because we just added an extra minute here. So I'm going to hand over to Rudolph or Samuel to present questions.
I've got a question. Rudolph, you okay for me to start?
Sure. Yeah, I've already spoken, so go for it.
So my question to Dr. Shabir and to Yusuf are, what is the problem with later Gospels adding more detail? And I say this with reference to the Quran as well. For instance, it will speak in an earlier time of a story of Noah, and then later on it will clarify things, and so you may know that story where it says, who comes into the boat with Noah, but then later on it will specify that his son didn't. And so you do see this within the stories of the Quran. So I'm just wanting to make sure that we're being balanced. So what's the problem with giving more detail and explaining things in a later gospel?
Okay, so Yusuf, you want me to answer that?
Yeah, sure, please.
Yeah, so Yusuf, of course, is quite capable of answering, but let me have a chance to speak as well. Yusuf has been speaking a lot. Okay, so Reverend, we're not saying because a later gospel adds more details that this is a problem. Just as we won't say that because another surah adds more detail about a previous story, that this is a problem. No, we're asking, is there an evolution in the story when the more details are added? Like, what kind of details are there? For example, in Mark's gospel, Jesus prays in the Garden of Gethsemane and says, now my soul is troubled. Father, let this cup pass away from me. Yet not my will, but thine be done. Okay, so he's finally submitting himself, but he wants it not to be so. In John's gospel, in chapter 12, verse number 27, he explicitly says, now my soul is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? But it is for this very reason that I came to this hour. So in other words, he's denying that he will ever pray like that. And indeed, in John's gospel, he doesn't pray like that. So what's going on here? There is an evolution in the presentation of Jesus. In Mark's gospel, Jesus is submitting himself to the cross, but he would rather not. And in John's gospel, he deliberately came into the world, and that's the story from the beginning. So John the Baptist announces from the beginning, this is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Jesus in the end says it is accomplished. It is not a cry of dereliction. So these are not simple details. This is the whole reworking of the story.
Yeah, okay. I mean, obviously, I would say that he's still troubled in John, but he's worked through that trouble. But I do take that there is absolutely a complete different emphasis that we're getting in that much shorter version in John. Yeah, okay. Now, well, I wanted to Rudolph, did you have a question?
Yes, I want to ask a question concerning the way you guys read. And again, I don't want to accuse, but just the actual reading of the the New Testament, and then some of the literary techniques that I've actually mentioned, like telescoping, thematic redaction, rugged grammar, some of the stylistic rewritings. I just want to ask, and I've mentioned some examples of, for instance, telescoping, for instance, used in the cursing of the fig tree, and the impact of that literary technique, which is evident within the text, which even critical scholars agree is actually there, that is used for streamlining for impact. Why would something like that be a problem when, in actual fact, these scholars are maintaining the broad narrative of what happened with Jesus, where he was, what he said, and in the end, how he suffered and how he resurrected? How would you dismiss the overall narrative if it's simply the broad narrative that is in check, but these stylistic differences exist? Where does the skepticism come from?
Okay, Yusuf, you want to take the first crack at that one?
Well, I'll deal with the first portion of the fig tree. Just basically regarding the fig tree, the indication that Rudolph's giving is some sort of telescoping and probably more of an emphasis on detail or fleshing out in a manner of speaking, and one gospel telescopes the other. Well, just to show that is not necessarily the case. It could be the case, but not always. Mark 11:12-14, Jesus was hungry. He goes to a fig tree, if he could find anything. When he comes to it, he finds nothing but leaves. It was not the season of figs. And then he curses it. He says, no one eats fruit. And then the next morning it dies. But the same episode in Matthew, he's hungry. He sees a fig tree. He goes to it. He finds nothing but leaves. And he says, no fruit may come from you. And the tree dies immediately. Now here's the point. If it was telescoping, there wouldn't be three major differences between two episodes. Because in Mark says that Jesus goes to the tree and he goes to see whether perhaps he could find anything on it. Matthew does not mention the reason for Jesus going to the tree. So hence the fact that Jesus was disappointed is not as clear in Matthew as it is in Mark. Matthew, on the other hand, does not mention that it was not the season of figs. Mark mentions that Jesus found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season of figs. So from Mark's gospel, the impression is clear that there was no problem with the tree. The problem was that it was not the season of figs. The episode in Mark, it highlights his limited knowledge. And it's easy to see that Matthew modifies this narrative to avoid the implication about Jesus' limited knowledge. It's difficult to see why Mark would take Matthew's account and so change it as to make it appear that Jesus made such a mistake and then curse the fig tree as a result of his own frustration. And of course, the last major difference is that in Mark's account, the tree was discovered withered the next day. But in Matthew, the power is that he makes it cursed, it withers immediately. So it's again clear to see that Matthew, number one, he magnifies the power of Jesus. And there's no reason for thinking that Mark want to minimize the power of Jesus. And the other point is that the ignorance which is found in Mark's gospel is no longer found in Matthew's gospel. So that goes simply beyond the aspect of simply telescoping. Shabir, you want to just wrap that up?
No, I think we don't need to belabor the point. I think Yusuf said it succinctly. I agree with what Yusuf said.
Okay. I've got another question. So if we're looking at the story developing and being embellished, then one of the ways that critical scholars will say this happens is with the virgin birth accounts in Matthew and Luke, that Mark doesn't have them. Matthew and Luke do have them, and that this is an embellishing of the story. What would you say then for the Quran taking over that account? And I assume you'd want to say authenticating those that embellishment in inverted commas.
Yeah, so I can say two things about that. First, if we take the virginal conception as a necessary Muslim belief, then a Muslim might reply that while we are looking at these trends as a whole, and we are going with the scholarship that shows that there is this development over time, not every instance of such a demonstration of development is necessarily true. It might appear to scholars outside of the Islamic faith, if they didn't have the Islamic faith as a background, they're looking at this as one of the instances of development. But with our Islamic faith, we would say, okay, this is not one of the instances of development, because we would believe, presupposing that Muslims have to believe this, we would believe that Jesus was conceived of a virgin, conceived by a virgin, and this is not one of those instances of development. So this must have been the story from the start. Now, if I answer in a different way, and this is now to start with the question, to what extent are Muslims required to believe that Jesus was conceived virginally? Now, it is very common that Maryam is referred to in Muslim circles, especially in the Arabic language, as Maryam al-Azra, Mary the Virgin. But does that mean that this is a title that is given to her in retrospect out of honor for her, because the Quran says that she had preserved her chastity, meaning that she was a virgin up until marriage? And then after marriage, she obviously, like women in general, she would go on to motherhood and would no longer be a virgin. But she is called a virgin in response to those who were accusing her of something, which the Quran called buhtana nazima. They accused her of adultery, and that through adultery she got her child. And the Quran is very clear in preserving her chastity. And so Muslims in general refer to her as Mary the Virgin, not necessarily meaning that she was a virgin at the time of her conception. Now, in the Quran, the story that is told about Mary in the 3rd chapter and also in the 19th chapter seems to mirror much of what is there in the Gospel according to Luke. However, when one reads the story in the Quran very carefully, one does not find that there is any emphasis on Jesus being conceived virginally. Sure, Mary protests, how can I have a child when no mortal has touched me? But this would be the protest of most girls in that traditional sort of environment. You go to a girl who is probably 12 years old, as Mary was at the time, probably was, and you say to her, well, you're going to be a mother soon. And she says, well, how can I be a mother? I'm not even married. And she's blushing in the meantime. Now, of course, people by this time know the mechanics that they are going to get married and they're going to have children. But of course, that is the natural response of a virgin girl in that traditional setting. So Mary could have given that response. So that just as in the book of Isaiah, chapter 7, where it is said a virgin will give birth, or a young woman will conceive, it doesn't necessarily mean that she will remain a virgin at the time of conception, as many biblical interpreters point out. Similarly, in the Quran, when Mary says, how can I have a child when no mortal has touched me? It doesn't mean that she wouldn't get married at all. And of course, the Quran does not go into more detail about this, but this seems to be a possibility for Muslims. So I've answered from two different perspectives. One, from the perspective that, yes, Muslims have to believe this, in which case Muslims would excuse this one instance as not a genuine case of development from early to later Gospels. And from the perspective that Muslims do not necessarily have to believe that Mary was a virgin at the time of conceiving Jesus, then, of course, Muslims would be open to the possibility that this is also one of those instances where the later Gospels developed the story from the way it had appeared in the previous ones. Maybe Yusuf wants to say something about it.
Just one last sentence. I know I don't want to take Samuel time. It's not in John. You see, it's not in Mark because it's too miraculous. But it's not in John because in John, there's an emphasis on Jesus' eternal pre-existence, a divine cosmic being. So having a miraculous origin would obviously go against that particular narrative. So it's not in Mark and John, but it's not in Mark and John for two different reasons. Mark, because it's too miraculous. In John, because he's already the eternal Son who became flesh. So to put it there as a virgin birth would, in a sense, deteriorate or basically lower the idea to have a genealogy and all of that, which you find in Luke and, of course, in Matthew. That would the point be. So there's different theological goals at play, both in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and, of course, in John.
Well, just at that point, how is it that you can be confident that to ascribe the motive for these authors? Because to me, what you were just saying there is, Mark didn't do it for this reason, John didn't do it for this reason. How do you know? How do you know that?
Well, because if you look at Matthew and Luke, they focus on Jesus' divine conception and at birth, whereas John, on the other hand, emphasizes the eternal Son who becomes flesh. So if he's the eternal Son who becomes flesh, his eternal pre-existence as a logos, being born through a kind of a miraculous human origin, in a manner of speaking, if John were to present that and juxtapose it similarly to what you've got in the prologue of John 1:1, it defeats the entire purpose, because the prologue in John establishes Christ's divinity at the outset, fulfilling the kind of theological purpose that the virgin birth stories in Matthew and Luke would fulfill. But if he has basically the virgin birth stories that you find in Matthew and Luke, then it would detract from the prologue, which is basically put out there as a basis for establishing Christ's divinity. So Mark has none of this, basically. Mark doesn't emphasize any miraculous origin. He's presented as a kind of a normal suffering servant of God. You see the miraculous emphasis in Matthew and Luke. Why does John not have it? And there's a reason that John doesn't have it, because always you've got the idea that the word is dwelling among us, which focuses on the act of incarnation rather than the mechanism of some sort of divine miraculous birth. So the focus would be that John is focusing on the divine sending, his signs, the direct relationship with God, and his eternal pre-existence, as opposed to the circumstance of his birth. And that's where you find the evolution. So in your question, Samuel, the virgin birth is also an indication of this kind of evolved Christological development. I think N.T. Wright makes that point. But his argument is, yes, it's there, but this is basically effectively an indication of progressive revelation of Christ as opposed to the evolution of his essential nature. That's a point.
Sure. I guess I was just pointing out that it's in the Quran as well. But anyway, I think
you see, if John had the genealogy, if John, for example, it does identify Jesus as Joseph's son, but if it has a kind of a genealogy, then effectively you are looking at a human genealogy, and the divine pre-existence in John 1:1 and what follows thereafter, it transcends that human genealogy. So you can't have the genealogy which you find in Matthew and Mark and Luke following the virgin birth in John's gospel, because the entire narrative structure will be different. That's why it's not found in John. That's why there's a theological difference.
That's our time. But Jesus is identified as the son of Joseph in the gospel. So in the gospel of John, he is given parentage as well. But I think that's our time. So
okay.
Yep, that's right. We're just coming to the 16 minutes of cross-examination. So we'll move into we're going to move into closing statements. And just a reminder of the order again. So Rudolph will go first, then Yusuf, then Samuel, and then Shabir, 4 minutes each. So Rudolph, I'm going to hand over to you to kick us off with the closing arguments.
You said 4 minutes.
I said 4 minutes. Yes.
4.
Gee, okay. God, this is going to be tough. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I would say that the fundamental flaw in today's presentation, and to people that usually are critical about what we see today on the topic, is a form of chronological snobbery. We see sometimes that there is the insistence that we need to take 21st century Western standards and take that and impose them upon first century ancient biography. But when we judge the Synoptic Gospels by the actual historical and literary standards of their own time, we can see that the skepticism we've heard today completely collapses. Now, let me show you why this is true, and let me give you a few reasons for that. First of all, when it looks at the Christology, this is the central question of Yusuf's argument. Yusuf claimed that the story of Jesus, it looks like it evolved from a mere human mark to the divine figure that we find in the later texts. But this is historically impossible, because the highest Christology we have, the declaration that Jesus is equal of God, is found in a text that predates Mark's, which is found in Philippians chapter 2, that was written by Paul before any of the Gospels were even penned. So you cannot evolve something into something else when it's already established from the very beginning of this very movement. Furthermore, Mark's Jesus is not a low Christology. I've showed that when Jesus claims to be the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven, he's invoking, yes, Daniel 7, which shows that royal king that would come to take his throne, but also the very Yahweh himself that would take his place amongst the nation of Israel. So he is sharing, and he's claiming to share the very throne of authority of Yahweh, and he shows quite clearly that he is taking that role of Yahweh himself, where the high priest instantly tore his robes and called out for blasphemy. Second, the point was made that there's a difference in the text, like the timing of the withering fig tree, or the centurion that came to Jesus directly, or sent elders, and there was the words used that there was a contradiction. But I've shown that scholarship shown us that this is a category misunderstanding of ancient historiography. What they call errors, actual historians actually call telescoping, thematic redaction, stylistic rewriting, etc., etc. So Matthew condescends and condenses Mark's stories, for instance, to highlight a theological climatic point. And so we can expect that for all of the other gospels. But when we look at these gospels, again, like I said, the broad narrative does not overthrow the very central narrative, which is independent and it's authentic and it's deduced from eyewitness testimony. And this is very important for us to understand. And third, the last point, they argue, for instance, that Matthew invented details like the guards at the tomb, and then other authors are trying to fix the holes in Mark's narrative, etc., etc. But it ignores the historical context, and we can see quite clearly that the Matthew writes with a specific point in mind to show that the rumors were false, that the Jewish Sanhedrin was in actual fact spreading. So this is just simply known as the legendary embellishment fallacy. And we know that when we read ancient biographies, we can see and expect quite clearly that the historical traditions are not just trying to airbrush the story, they are trying to show exactly what the historical motive was at the very time. So let me also then just say lastly, in my last 17 seconds, if the early church was orchestrating a massive pious fraud to evolve Jesus into a god and fix the historical discrepancies, why don't they leave us with 4 different gospels that still disagree? That is simply not the case. They did not simply smooth out or perfect the narrative. They deliberately chose to preserve 4 distinct voices. And they were unharmonized. They were messy. But they were showing the complexity and the differences, but the story of Jesus being perfectly intact. And that is the core reality of the stories that we need to look at. And I'll leave you with that. I think that's 4 minutes. Dave?
Thanks, Rudolph. Yep.
Or do I have a minute left?
No, you've done your 4.
Okay, awesome.
I would give you a minute, Rudolph.
Thanks, Joseph.
Yusuf, I'll let you move into your 4 minutes of closing argument.
Thank you for that. It's great discussing with all of you. I learned something new from Rudolph, something called chronological snobbery. I'm certainly going to use it in the future in my discussions. Just want to start off with a kind of a brief summation that I think all of us accept Markan priority, all of us here. And that's the accepted scholarly theory that Mark was written first and served as a primary source for the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. But the very existence of Markan priority creates a synoptic problem. That is a close relationship between the first 3 Gospels by highlighting how Matthew and Luke refined or elaborated on Mark's shorter narrative. Now, it's only the development of Christology, meaning the progression from the lower, more functional Christology in Mark to a more developed Christology in Matthew and Luke that is considered by biblical scholars to lead to give us this whole idea of Markan priority. That's how Markan priority emerged. So you can't accept Markan priority and not accept the argumentation that led to the conclusion. You accept the conclusion, but you disagree on how we come to the whole principle of Markan priority. Markan priority exists because of the identification of the fact that there appears to be a kind of an evolution or a different way in how Jesus is presented. Now, I made the point that many conservative scholars, N.T. Wright being one of them, accepts his point. So if he was debating today, he wouldn't make the argument of a high Christology. He would argue, as we are arguing today, that yes, Mark presents a very humanly idea of Jesus. He would obviously believe in the divinity of Christ, but he would argue against a kind of a static portrayal where Jesus pronounces his divinity at the commencement from day one. He will say, as many evangelical scholars would argue, that there's no theistic evolution, or there's a progressive revelation aligned for the idea that Jesus entered human history, consciousness, manifestation, then increased in wisdom and stature, rather than a preset script played out. What you are saying, what my friends are saying, is that, look, there's a preset script, that there's a high Christology from the outset. And even the conservative Christian scholars don't make the point. And I'm saying that from a missionary discourse, it's a poor apologetic. If you were to adopt the position by conservative scholars like N.T. Wright, and I think even to an extent Richard Barkham, they would make the very point that there's theistic evolution, progressive revelation, but this in no way indicates that Mark has or starts off with a high Christology. Rudolph's making the point again about telescoping, and one telescopes the others. Evolving Christology is not considered telescoping because it represents, this is the point, it represents a developmental narrative process rather than a static collapse of time. Both concepts, deal with interpreting Christ, but they differ in their view of how prophecy and in history, in fact, relate to Jesus. So it's not correct to say telescoping. We're not looking at it anachronistically. Modern evolving approaches, such as Tom Wright, they focus on the narrative continuity of the entire biblical story, and they argue that it's building towards a climax rather than collapsing the past, present, and future into one whole immediate vision. And that's what you're saying. You accept the conclusion of Markan priority, but despite accepting that, you reject the argument which leads you to the belief in Markan priority, and then you collapse the past, present, and the future into one entire vision by making the point that, look, high Christology was in Mark, and if we are arguing otherwise, there's a conspiracy. No, we're not even saying that there's a conspiracy. There's no conspiracy. This is how stories and ideas develop. So arguing that Matthew and Luke frequently modified Markan material to present a more exalted view of Jesus is not telescoping, but is actually seen as evolving the passage. The I am sayings, in the beginning was the word, and the word was with God. All of that. All this basically points to an evolution. I think the argument made at the end of the day is far more valid. I would appreciate if both my friends accept the conservative position, because at least they would argue they would agree with us, but they would differ in terms of what that would represent. They would say that's progressive revelation as opposed to a development of evolving Christology. I think that's a far more honest approach to adopt, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Yusuf. I'm going to move on to Samuel for your 4 minutes. Over to you.
Over here. So thank you, Yusuf and Shabir, for today. And I just want to start off by saying it's a pleasure to do this, and I've learned something. So Yusuf, your reference to Exodus 23 is something I'm going to have to follow up. So that's excellent. My concluding statements. First of all, I want to say with Markan priority and the discussion we've had, Markan priority and the synoptic problem or question to be solved is actually a good thing. It's not a negative problem. It's a good thing because we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we can bring them together and learn something of their history by comparing them to each other. As I said, one of the worst things that could have happened is if the Christians burnt Mark, Luke, and John and just kept Matthew. If that had happened, we couldn't take that step back and analyze the original sources. And so the fact that we're able to have this question, this discussion, is actually a really good thing and something that Christians should embrace. Now, I disagree with Yusuf saying that Markan priority automatically leads to development, and it came about from development. No, it didn't come about from any supposed development that happens. It came about from source criticism, from comparing the four together and just saying, look, we can identify sources. Interpreting those sources then becomes a different thing. But Markan priority is not based on any development. It's based on comparing these different texts and being able to identify their sources, and so being able to make a chronology between them. So I just disagree there. Now, my points were in my presentation that when we want to compare the Gospels, yes, you can compare the Gospels and say Matthew and Luke have have changed Mark, and this shows some development. But I also gave the example of where the development sometimes goes the other way, where in Mark it says he's blaspheming, only God can do this, whereas Matthew doesn't have that. And so I want to say, if you wanted to, you could do this exercise and try to get sources and try to get examples that go the other way, but they seem to go both ways on some occasions. And so what I showed was that when we give that big overall picture of the gospel, we see that in all of them, Jesus is called teacher, rabbi, son of David, Lord, Messiah, son of God, son of man, and God is Father. We saw that all of them talk about Jesus in terms of Isaiah 40 and possibly Malachi 3 or Exodus 23. In all of them, he's the heavenly son of of Psalm 110. John speaks of him in pre-existent terms. And in all of them, he doesn't know the hour. He's given the virgin birth in Matthew and Luke, but in all of them, he does signs. He's crucified, dies, and is raised up again, and is spoken about at the final supper in terms of his death being a sacrifice for sin. So there is huge, overwhelming agreement. And I would say that the differences we see are deliberate complements, as John points out, that he is complementing the synoptics. These are complements, and they don't change the major themes or the major events of what happens. And as I brought up, the Quran too has its own complementary way in which it will tell a story earlier in Muhammad's career, and then later on will retell it, giving more detail and explaining things. So I can't see how a Muslim can see that as a problem for the apostolic prophets of Jesus to be giving complementary information in this way, particularly when we look at things like the virgin birth, which would be seen by academic scholars as an embellishment or a bringing up, an increasing of the story. But in terms of the Quran, it's accepted. So it accepts that extra work of the apostles. And so I just want to finish up by saying thank you again. I think that the Gospels stand, and there is this one unified testimony to Jesus. Thank you.
Thank you, Samuel. We'll move into our final closing argument, Dr. Shabir.
Okay, gentlemen, I'm so glad we've done this tonight, and I thank you again for including me in this fascinating discussion. Yusuf has made the interesting point that if we go with Markan priority, we must accept what leads to that conclusion. What leads to that conclusion, as Craig Evans pointed out in the book, 4 views on the synoptic problem, is that when scholars look at the individual episodes, as Reverend Samuel said that they did, well, they see that the later Gospels are the ones that develop. So then they ask which would be the one that is more developed, and that would be obviously the later gospel. And so when they find the one that is least developed, the most primitive, they say that one is the first gospel. That's how they arrive at Markan priority. So if you accept Markan priority, you must accept that Mark is actually prior in terms of its theology and the development of the narrative, and that the other gospels develop it further later. Samuel and Rudolph have both said, okay, it's a good thing that we have all of these 4 gospels. Look at that. Now we can compare and so on. Well, it's a good thing for researchers to go and trace the origins of these individual narratives in the 4 gospels. But wouldn't it have been far better if the Holy Spirit, as Rudolph, I think it was, who said, look, Jesus, said that the Spirit will come and inspire you, and then the writers are writing on this inspiration. Well, wouldn't it have been better if the Holy Spirit had inspired the disciples to produce a singular narrative? Then, of course, the believers would have no problem. Yes, the skeptics may doubt, but at least the believers will know that this is what came through the Spirit of God as the singular narrative. How is it that the Spirit would give 4 different inspirations like this and give conflicting details? Like, for example, the guard at the tomb. This is not a simple detail. If you try to see how this this detail from Matthew's gospel will fit with the other narratives. It doesn't. In the other gospels, the women come to the tomb and they're surprised to find it empty. They don't know what is going on. They go back and report to the disciples. In the case of Mark, they saw a young man who presumably told them what happened, but still they're a little bit confused. But in Matthew's gospel, Matthew makes it that while the women are coming to the tomb, like in their presence, the angel comes down from heaven and rolls away the stone, and then the guards fall dead, and so on. It's an entirely different narrative. And what are we to say about Matthew's addition to the story, where at the time of Jesus' death, the bodies of the saints came out of the tombs and appeared to many in the city? So this is only in Matthew. As I said, one gospel develops the story in one direction. Evolution doesn't always take place in a straight line. It branches out like a tree. And this is one branch that Matthew has followed and nobody else has picked up. Now, in terms of theology, Yusuf has shown excellently that the Gospels developed the theology of Jesus. And Reverend Green has passed over the idea that John represents Jesus as the Logos. Logos Christology was a big thing in early Christianity, and then that was replaced by the Trinitarian doctrine eventually. Rudolph mentioned the scholar Larry Hurtado. Larry Hurtado, okay, you quote him because he says there was an early high Christology, but Larry Hurtado saying that early Christology was part of Binitarianism. So Christianity was Binitarian before it became Trinitarian. So we have to see the development all along the way. Yes, you say that Paul, before the Gospels, already declared a high Christology, but what you're missing, Rudolph, is that the Gospels are trying to follow in Paul's footsteps. And in doing so, they have gone away from the teachings of Jesus, on whom be peace. So let's all go back to the teachings of Jesus by retracing how the stories developed about him through the four Gospels and reconstruct what Jesus really was. And to do that, very simply, just go to the Quran, because the Quran tells us the story about Jesus as a revelation from the Almighty God. Thank you all very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shabir. I do want to take this opportunity just to thank each of our speakers for participation today and all your preparation. I'll start off, Yusuf, thank you so much for getting up so early there in South Africa.
It's always a pleasure. We will sacrifice our time for the Canadians and Australians.
and thank you, Rudolph, as well. I know you're coming from the same part of the world, so thank you for getting up so early.
It's only a pleasure to speak with you guys.
And then Reverend Samuel, thank you for your time in Australia.
It's a pleasure to be with everyone, and thanks for hosting, David.
Thank you.
My pleasure. And thank you, Dr. Shabir in Toronto. I know it's very late there.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure.
I want to thank you, David. I want to thank you, David. You've always been a great host.
Yes, I second that, David.
Absolute pleasure to host each of you gentlemen. And I also want to thank all who are listening online, who've joined online. Thank you very much for joining today. And I wish each of you a good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Good speaking with you, gentlemen.